The cold hit him first. Not the kind of cold you get in winter. It was the cold of high altitudes, the kind that makes your bones go numb and your fingers stop responding. Dan opened his eyes and saw the sky. Not the ceiling, not a lamp, the sky. Vast and empty. The wind whipped his face so hard that tears streamed down of their own accord. He tried to raise his arm but couldn't. His wrists were tied to a wooden stake with rough rope. He was standing on a stone platform, and there was no ground beneath his feet. Or rather, there was ground, but far below. So far that the clouds drifted between him and it like dirty cotton wool. Standing before him was a man in a purple cloak. He was reading something from a parchment in a voice accustomed to being listened to in silence. Dan didn't know the language, but he understood every word. The man in the cloak was saying that for treason and doubting the wisdom of his majesty, the accused was sentenced to eternal exile on the shard of Tyrion. That justice would be served, that his soul would find rest. Dan wanted to say that a mistake had been made, that he knew of no his majesty, that he was an engineer from another world, and the last thing he remembered was a wet staircase and his temple hitting the concrete. But his mouth wouldn't obey him. His throat was so dry that his tongue stuck to the roof of his mouth. The man in the cloak took a step back. Behind him, 4 soldiers in leather armor retreated. They moved quickly, like people who didn't want to linger in this place. There was a grinding sound, low and heavy. The stone slab beneath Dan's feet trembled, that it shifted, that it broke away from the edge of the enormous floating island and slowly drifted off to the side. Dan watched as the massive block of flying stone receded. Houses stood on its edge, real houses made of dark brick with smoking chimneys. People were walking between the houses. Some of them didn't even turn around. The slab was drifting farther and farther away. The wind was picking up. The island was turning into a dark spot against the backdrop of the sunset sky. Dan was left alone, tied to a stake, on a chunk of rock the size of half a football field, 4 kilometers above the ground. He closed his eyes and exhaled. Then he opened them again. Nothing had changed. The sky was still there. The clouds were still there. So were the ropes around his wrists. He looked at the knots. He looked closely. And he almost laughed. The knots were amateurish. A simple bowline knot. No safety knot. No securing loop. Any climber could untie them with their eyes closed. Dan untied them in 90 seconds. His hands were shaking from the cold, but his fingers remembered. 10 years in the mountains had taught him one simple thing. Fingers always remember. Even when the mind can't think straight. He rubbed his wrists. The skin was scraped raw. The pain was real. Not a dream. Not a hallucination. He was standing on a rock in the sky, and this was really happening. Dan took his first step, then his second. The slab was uneven. The old stone was full of cracks and chips. Here and there, strange plants with fleshy leaves poked out of the crevices. At the far edge of the slab, 2 columns rose up, broken off in the middle. The remains of something that had once been a building or an arch. A pile of rubble lay between the columns. Dan walked to the edge of the slab and looked down. His stomach clenched into a fist. 4 kilometers of emptiness, maybe more. Clouds covered the ground almost completely. Only through a single gap did a flash of green appear. Fields. A river. Tiny squares of houses. Another world. Inaccessible. He stepped back from the edge, sat down on a rock, wrapped his arms around his knees, and began to think. Panic sat in his throat like a lump, but Dan knew that panic kills faster than the cold, faster than thirst, faster than hunger. In the mountains, he'd seen experienced climbers die not from a fall, but from ceasing to think. Fear shut down the brain. And without a brain, a person at high altitude is just a bag of bones. He forced himself to breathe steadily. Breathe in for a count of 4. Breathe out for a count of 6. Again. Again. The lump in his throat grew smaller. His thoughts stopped racing. He began to count. Water, food, shelter from the wind. 3 main tasks. Without water, he'd last 3 days. Without food, 3 weeks. Without shelter from the night wind at this altitude, he might not even survive the first night. He stood up and went to examine his shard. The slab was 40 meters long and 25 meters wide, irregularly shaped, almost flat on one edge. On the other, jagged with ledges. 2 columns on the north side, a pile of rubble, several large fragments that had once been a wall, and cracks. Lots of cracks. Those same fleshy plants were growing out of some of them. Dan plucked a leaf. He turned it over in his hands. Thick, dense. Something moist inside. He snapped the leaf in half. A clear sap oozed from the break. Dan sniffed it. It smelled like grass and something slightly sweet. He touched the sap to his lips. He waited a minute, no burning sensation, no tingling either. He licked it. The taste was strange, as if a cucumber and aloe had decided to create something new. It wasn't unpleasant. He took a small sip of the sap and decided to wait an hour. If his stomach didn't cramp up in an hour, it meant he could drink some more. An hour passed. His stomach didn't cramp up. It was the first piece of good news all day. The sun was sinking below the horizon. The temperature was dropping by the minute. The wind was picking up. Dan squeezed into a gap between two pieces of broken wall and a column. The wind didn't reach him as much there. He shoveled some small rubble into a makeshift wall, locking the opening. It looked shabby, but it was something. He lay curled up on the cold stone and looked at the stars. The stars were alien, not a single familiar constellation. This wasn't his world, not his sky, not his life. Somewhere down below, beneath the clouds, people were sleeping in their beds, eating hot meals, talking to one another. And he lay on a rock in the sky like a forgotten object. The cold seeped to his bones. Dan didn't sleep all night. Not because he couldn't, but because he was afraid that if he fell asleep, he might not wake up. By morning, he was so hard his teeth were chattering, but he was alive. Dawn came slowly. First, the sky in the east turned gray, then pink, then gold. And Dan saw what he hadn't been able to make out in the twilight the night before. Around his shard, others hung in the sky. Dozens, maybe hundreds. Some were small like his. Others were enormous. On one, he could make out entire buildings. On another, something resembling trees. Clouds drifted between them. And something else. Dan stood up. He walked to the northern edge of the slab. He squinted. Air was moving along the vertical edge of the nearest large shard. He could tell by the way the stone's contours were distorting. The outlines were trembling ever so slightly. How dust from the cracks rose upward instead of falling downward. An updraft. Steady. Powerful. Warm air from the sun-heated rock mass rose along the edges as if through an invisible tube. Dan knew what a thermal was. He knew how it worked. He knew that a glider in such a current could gain altitude without an engine. And he knew that the distance to the nearest fragment was 300 meters, maybe 400. For a glider, that's nothing. For a person without a glider, it's an eternity. But a glider could be built. If there were materials. If there were time. If you didn't die of thirst first. He returned to the columns. He looked at the northern wall of the nearest fragment and froze. Drops glistened on the stone, small, frequent, dew. The night's chill had condensed moisture from the air onto the stone's surface. By noon, it would evaporate. But right now, it was there. Dan took off his shirt. The fabric was coarse. Local. Not his. The body in which he had awakened was dressed in the simple clothes of an exile. He tore the shirt into long strips. He stretched them at a slight angle between two protrusions of rock. He tucked the bottom edge of the strips into a small indentation in the slab. Drops of dew trickled down the fabric. Slowly, one by one, but they trickled. By noon, 3 sips worth of water had collected in the indentation. He drank it and felt his body come to life. 3 sips. That was the difference between death in 2 days and life. The next morning, he improved the system. He added more strips. He adjusted the angle. He carved out a second hollow. By sunset on the second day, he had half a mug of water. Or rather, half a hollow. He didn't have a mug, but he had water. On the third day, he found a flat piece of rock that could serve as a container. He hollowed it out, stone against stone. He worked all day. His hands were covered in blood, but by evening he had a stone bowl. Rough, crooked, but a bowl nonetheless. By the end of the first week, Dan had built a system of 4 sloping planes. Each was made of strips of fabric stretched over stone ledges. All 4 converged into a single drain. 5 liters a day. He wouldn't die of thirst anymore. Now he could think about food. The fleshy plants growing out of the cracks turned out to be edible. Not tasty, but edible. He ate them raw, chewed for a long time, swallowed slowly. A week later, he found a nest in one of the deep cracks. The bird was strange. It was the size of a pigeon but had long, narrow wings and black eyes without pupils. It wasn't afraid of him. It had apparently never seen humans before. There were 3 eggs in the nest, small ones, with bluish shells. Dan took one. The bird watched him and didn't move. He promised her he'd repay the debt. The egg was warm. He drank it raw, and it was the best breakfast of his life. He left the other 2 untouched. The bird had to hatch the chicks. More birds meant more eggs. It was a long-term calculation. By the end of the second week, Dan had stopped merely surviving and started living. The difference was simple. Survival is when you think about today. Life is when you think about tomorrow. He began to truly explore his shard. Every crack, every shard, every stone. And he discovered something strange. The material the columns were made of was different from ordinary stone. It was lighter, stronger, and warm to the touch, even at night. Dan ran his fingers over the surface. Smooth. Too smooth for hand-carved stone. He tried to chip off a piece. Stone against stone didn't even leave a scratch. He tried a sharp flake of flint. Nothing. This material wasn't stone, nor was it metal. It was something else. Something Dan had seen before. In the workshop. A lightweight, durable composite with properties similar to titanium alloys. He couldn't work with it bare-handed, but he could memorize it. And he began to do what he did best. Calculate. Using charcoal from a charred plant, he sketched on a flat stone. Lines, angles, numbers. The wing's shape. Wingspan. Chord length. Load per square meter. Flow velocity. Angle of attack. He was designing a glider. Not beautiful. Not elegant. The simplest possible. The frame could be made from the debris of an ancient arch if he could break off pieces long enough. The covering would be made of fabric if he could find any more fabric. The ropes from the stake were still lying where he'd left them. These would serve as the frame's tension members. Succulent plants provided fiber if they were dried and unbraided. These were additional fasteners. He sketched. He calculated. He erased. He sketched again. At night, he lay in his shelter and looked at the neighboring fragment. 300 meters. Maybe 400. There was more rock there, more plants, maybe water, maybe people. He needed a glider, and he would build it. Building the glider took 18 days. 18 days of hell. The main problem wasn't the calculations. Dan kept the calculations in his head. The main problem was the materials. The fragments of the ancient arch were made of that same strange composite. Strong, light, and absolutely unyielding. Dan couldn't cut it. He couldn't break it. He couldn't bend it. He spent 2 days trying to pry even a single piece away from the main mass. He hit it with a stone. He scraped it with flint. He tried to pry it loose. Nothing worked. On the third day, he noticed that one of the fragments was lying separate from the column. It must have broken off during that ancient catastrophe that had hurled all of this into the sky. It was about 2 meters long and as thick as an arm. Almost a perfect spar. Dan tried to lift it. Light. Unbelievably light for its size. Like an aluminum pipe. He found 3 more similar pieces of debris in the pile of rubble at the base of the columns. Different lengths, different thicknesses, but all made of the same material. It wasn't enough for a full-scale frame. But Dan wasn't building a full-scale glider. He was building a minimal one. A frame made of 4 rods. 2 main spars running lengthwise. 2 crossbars for rigidity. He made the fastenings out of rope, the very same rope they used to tie him to the stake. He cut it into pieces with a sharp chip of rock and tied knots he knew by heart. The bowline, the double-clove hitch, and the stricter. He tested each knot under load. He hung stones from it, pulled on it with his hands, jumped up and down. The rope was coarse but strong, linen or something similar. The knots held. The covering was the biggest problem. He had no fabric left. His shirt had gone into the capacitor. He couldn't take off his pants because he froze without them at night. He spent 2 days looking for a solution, and he found it in the cracks. The fleshy plants he ate had long, fibrous roots. If he pulled these roots out and dried them in the sun, they became stiff and brittle, useless. But if he pounded them with a stone before drying and unraveled them into thin strands, he could weave a coarse cloth from those strands. Dan wove for 10 days. His hands were covered in bloody blisters. His fingers were swollen, but he kept weaving. Every day from dawn until dusk, he took breaks only for water and food. The fabric turned out loose and not airtight. For a normal wing, that would have been a disaster. But Dan remembered the sap from the fleshy plants, thick and sticky. If he applied it to the fabric and let it dry in the sun, it would harden into a thin film. Not perfect, but enough for the wing to hold air. He collected the sap in a stone bowl, applied it to the fabric layer by layer, let it dry. Applied it again. After 3 layers, the fabric became almost airtight. The wing turned out ugly, crooked, asymmetrical. Dan looked at it and saw all the flaws. The trailing edge was uneven. The profile was too thick at the root. The left spar was 2 centimeters shorter than the right. Any gliding instructor would have thrown it in the trash. But Dan wasn't at the airfield. He was on a rock in the sky. And this ugly piece of plant-based fabric on ancient rods was his only chance. He checked the structure over and over. He shook it. He loaded it down. He held it up to the wind. The wing creaked but held. He made the controls as simple as possible, shifting his body weight just like on a hang glider. No rudders, no ailerons, just the pilot's weight. He wove the harness from the same plant fibers, a chest strap, 2 loops for the shoulders, a safety knot around his waist. If one loop broke, the other would hold. If both loops broke, the chest strap would hold him. If everything broke, he'd fall 4 kilometers, but he tried not to think about that. On the morning of the 18th day, the glider was ready. Dan stood on the northern edge of the fragment and held it by the crossbar. The wind was flapping the fabric. The wing trembled. 300 meters ahead, the neighboring fragment hung in the air. It was 10 times larger than his. On it, Dan could see trees or something resembling trees. An updraft flowed between the 2 fragments. Dan could feel it on his skin. Warm air rose along the jagged edges like an invisible river. If he entered this current at the right angle, the glider would rise. If he missed it, the glider would plummet. And then it would be 4 kilometers. Dan fastened his harness. He checked every knot, every loop, every connection. His hands didn't tremble. That surprised him. He thought he'd be afraid. But there was no fear. There was a cold clarity, the kind that comes when a climber stands before a crux section of a route and knows there's no turning back. He took a running start. 3 steps. 4. 5. The rock ended beneath his feet, and he flew. The first few seconds were a freefall. The glider sagged downward and his stomach dropped into his throat. The canopy flapped in the wind. The left wing tip twitched. Dan shifted his weight to the right. He leveled off. The glider stopped falling and began to fly. At an angle, crooked, listing to the left, but flying. The wind hit from below. An updraft caught the wing and pulled it upward. Dan felt himself being lifted. He felt the ground, which had just been getting closer, begin to recede. He was gaining altitude, slowly, in jerks. The glider was shaking. The cross-bracing creaked so that it seemed as if it were about to fall apart, but it held. The knots held. The fabric held. 300 meters. He flew them in 4 minutes. The longest 4 minutes of his life. The neighboring Oskalok loomed like a wall of gray rock. Dan looked for a landing site. He spotted a relatively flat area between 2 rocky ridges. He shifted his weight forward. The glider began to descend. Too fast. He jerked his body backward, pulling the nose up. The speed dropped. The ground leaped toward him. Impact. The glider slammed into the rock. The spar snapped. The fabric tore. Dan rolled across the rocky surface, scraping his hands and knees. He came to a stop. He lay there. He was breathing. Everything ached, but he was alive. And he was on another shard. He had flown across. For the first time in the history of this world, a human had flown from one shard to another of his own free will. Not in a balloon that bursts. Not on a rope that wasn't long enough. On a wing. On a piece of plant fiber stretched over ancient rods and glued together with grass sap. Dan landed. He looked at the wreckage of his glider. One spar had broken on landing. The fabric was torn in 2 places. The suspension system was intact. The other spar was intact. It could be repaired. He looked around. This fragment was different. Larger, more complex. There were real walls here. Remnants of buildings, arches, staircases leading nowhere. And plants. Lots of plants. Not just the fleshy bushes growing out of the cracks. Trees grew here. Not very tall. With silvery bark and narrow leaves, but trees nonetheless. Dan stood up and walked deeper into the fragment. Half an hour later, he found a plaza, a real plaza paved with slabs. In the center stood a basin, a large stone basin on a pedestal. It contained water, clean, clear. Rainwater collected in the basin and didn't evaporate because the broad leaves of the trees cast a shadow. Dan dipped his hands into the water. It was cold. He scooped up a handful and drank. Then another, and another. Then he sat down next to the basin and just sat there. Water, trees, shade, walls sheltering him from the wind. It was almost like home. He explored the square thoroughly and found 2 more buildings with intact roofs. Inside, it was dry and quiet. There were drawings on the walls, faded, almost erased by time. But Dan could make out the figures, people with wings. Not angels, people in some kind of contraptions, flying machines. He stared at these drawings for a long time. Those who had once lived here could fly too. They built wings. And judging by the drawings, they built them much better than he did. That meant there might be tools here, materials, maybe blueprints. He needed to search every rock. But first, he had to fix the glider. Because there was still a condenser left on his first shard. 5 liters of water a day. He couldn't just abandon it. He needed a crossing, a permanent one. A reliable one. Not a one-time glider, but a system. A rope. A Tyrolean traverse. 300 meters of rope between 2 points. Secure it. Tighten it. A pulley. And then he could move back and forth as many times as necessary. He didn't have any rope, but he had plant fibers, and he had time. He started braiding that very day. He spent 7 days braiding the rope. The plant fibers were thin, and individually none of them could support a person's weight. But Dan knew that a rope isn't just a single fiber. A rope is a system. 3 fibers twisted together hold 5 times more than 3 separate ones. He twisted strands of 10 fibers. Then he twisted 3 strands into a cord, then 3 cords into a rope. Slow, monotonous work. His hands ached constantly. His fingers were covered in calluses and cuts. But the rope was growing, meter by meter. By the end of the 7th day, he had a little over 350 meters. With enough to spare for fastening and slack, he repaired the glider in 2 days. He replaced the broken spar with a suitable fragment found in the ruins of the new fragment. He patched the fabric with fresh strips. He checked every knot. He flew back to his first fragment. This time, the landing was smoother. He was learning. Now he had to tension the rope. He secured one end to a column on the first oscillok. It was a double knot with a safety check and an extra loop for backup. He checked it 3 times. Then he tied a coil of the rope to the glider's suspension system. And he flew again. The 3rd flight. Each subsequent one was a little easier than the last. Not because it was any less scary, but because his body was memorizing the movements. On the new fragment, he secured the other end of the rope to a massive arch. He pulled it tight. He checked it. The rope hummed between the 2 fragments like a thin line against the sky. 300 meters of plant-based rope 4 kilometers above the ground. It looked insane. He made the pulley from a piece of that very ancient material. He found a fragment with a natural groove down the middle. He smoothed the edges with a stone. It wasn't a perfect pulley, but it glided along the rope well enough. He made the suspension loop from the remains of the rope. He made his first crossing at sunset on the 7th day. He hung onto the pulley, pushed off from the rock, and off he went. The rope sagged under his weight. The pulley creaked. The wind rocked him like a pendulum. 4 kilometers of emptiness beneath his feet. The clouds were pink from the sunset. He reached the middle where the sag was greatest and stopped. From there, he had to pull himself up with his hands. He pulled himself up. Meter by meter, his arms were on fire. His shoulders were screaming, but he made it. He rolled over the edge of the rock onto the new fragment and lay face down until his breathing returned to normal. The crossing worked. It was crooked and difficult, but it worked. The next day, he began to improve the system. He added his 2nd rope below the first one for his legs. Now he could walk along the lower rope while holding onto the upper one, slower than on the roller, but easier on his arms. He walked between the 2 fragments every day, carried water from the first one, explored the ruins on the 2nd, and on the 3rd day of his explorations, he found something that changed everything. At the far edge of the 2nd fragment, behind a row of half-ruined walls, was a platform. There were shelves on the clearing, stone shelves built into the wall. Objects lay on them, tools. At first, Dan couldn't believe his eyes. He stepped closer. He picked up the first object, long, thin, with a pointed end, made of the same ancient material, lightweight, durable, sharp as a scalpel. He ran his finger along the blade, and his finger instantly turned red. A knife. Or a chisel. A tool for working the stone. There were more lying nearby. Different shapes, different sizes. Some resembled chisels, others drills. Still others, files. All made of the same material. All sharp. All intact after thousands of years. Dan picked up one of the tools and tried running it along a fragment of the column. The tool left a groove, clear and deep. The ancient composite yielded to the ancient tool. Dan sat down on a rock and sat there in silence for a long time. Tools capable of working this material that changed everything. It meant he could cut rods to the desired length and shape. He could make precise joints. He could build not from what he found, but from what he designed. He could build a real glider. Dan carried all the tools to the clearing with a bowl. He sorted them by type. He counted them. 23 items: knives, chisels, drills, files, 2 hammers with short handles, and one more item whose purpose he didn't immediately understand. A flat disc with a hole in the center and fine teeth along the edge. A saw, a circular saw. Without a motor, of course, but with a handle for turning by hand. Dan inserted the axle. He tried turning it. The blade spun easily. The teeth bit into the ancient composite and cut through it like butter. He laughed. For the first time in many days, he laughed for real. With these tools, he could build. From that day on, the work took a different turn. Dan no longer picked up random scraps. He sought out parts. Precise. Calculated. Every spar the right length. Every stringer the right profile. Every joint was fitted so that the parts slid together without a gap. The second airframe was nothing like the first. The first was a piece of desperation. The second was a machine. A wing with the correct airfoil. Symmetrical. With rounded wingtips that reduced turbulence. A frame that was rigid and light. A suspension system with 3 attachment points instead of 2. And a rudder, the simplest kind. A plate on the trailing edge of the wing that could be moved with a rope. But a rudder. Maneuverability. He built it in 12 days. He flew it cautiously. First, short hops. Then longer ones. Then he circled his own shard. Then he circled the neighboring one. The glider responded. Not perfectly, but it responded. On the 4th day of flying, Dan decided to go on a reconnaissance mission. He climbed in an updraft to his maximum altitude. He reached 200 meters above his shard, and he looked around. What he saw took his breath away. The fragments stretched in every direction to the horizon. Not dozens, hundreds. An entire archipelago of floating rocks. Some were enormous. On one, he saw something resembling an entire sea block with squares and wide streets. On another, water glistened. A lake. A real lake on a flying rock. On a third one, trees grew so thickly that from above it looked like a green island. And air was moving between them. Dozens of updrafts, thermals, slipstreams, rotational vortices behind the large fragments. Dan, read them like a map. It's safe here. You can gain altitude here, but not here. The vortex behind that ridge will break the wing, and that current between the 2 exchanges fragments is an accelerated jet. Dangerous but fast. You could fly anywhere. Not right away, not in this glider, but he could. And then he saw something else. On a fragment half a kilometer to the east. Movement. Not a bird. Not the wind. A human figure. Small at that distance, but definitely human. The figure was standing at the edge of the shard, looking at him. Looking through a spotting scope. Dan waved his hand. The figure froze, then slowly raised a hand in response. Dan turned the glider around and flew toward her. Landing on a foreign shard was risky. He didn't know the terrain. He didn't know the wind conditions on approach. But the landing area looked fairly level. He began his descent. He touched down hard but without damage. He stood up. He unbuckled his harness. And he saw a girl standing before him. Young, thin, with a weather-beaten face and dark circles under her eyes. She was standing 10 paces away from him, holding a pair of binoculars with fingers that had turned white from tension. She looked at him as if she were seeing a ghost. Then she swallowed and said she'd been watching the shards for a year, that she'd seen smoke appear on his rock, then movement, then something that looked like a wing, that she couldn't believe her eyes, that she thought she was going mad. Dan asked her name. She said her name was Mira Calden, that she was a cartographer, that she'd been exiled here along with her younger brother a year and a half ago because her father had tried to map the shards. Dan asked where her brother was. Mira turned away. Then she pointed toward the far edge of her shard. There, she said. He's sick. Very sick. He can barely get out of bed. He has no water. Or rather, he does, but not much. She collects dew with her hands every morning, but it's not enough. Dan nodded. He said he'd be back tomorrow, and that he'd bring water. He returned the next morning, with water. He carried it in a stone bowl he carved himself. The flight took 6 minutes. He already knew this route. He knew where the current picked up, where to veer to the right, where to begin his descent. Mira was waiting for him at the edge. She hadn't slept all night. He could tell by her eyes, red, swollen. She was afraid he wouldn't come. That yesterday had been a hallucination, that she'd finally gone mad from loneliness, hunger, and the wind. Dan landed. He held out the bowl to her. She took it with both hands. She looked at the water. She looked at him. Then she turned and walked quickly toward the far edge of the shard. Dan followed her. Mira's brother was lying in a recess between two walls. He looked about 16 years old, thin, pale. His lips were chapped and bleeding. His eyes were cloudy. He was breathing heavily and rapidly. Dehydration, severe. Mira knelt down beside him and lifted his head. She began to give him water. Dan stopped her. He said she shouldn't give him too much at once. Small sips, often. 2 or 3 sips every 10 minutes. Otherwise, his body wouldn't absorb it and the water would come right back out. Mira looked at him, and she nodded. Dan left them a bowl. He said he'd fly back again. Tomorrow. And the day after tomorrow. Every day. Until he built a proper water supply system. Mira didn't say anything. She gave her brother water, in small sips. Every 10 minutes, just as he'd said. Dan flew away, and flew back the next day. And the next, and the next. Every day he brought water. Every day Mira waited for him at the edge of the shard. After a week, her brother began to come too. After 2 weeks, he could sit up. After 3, he stood up and took a few steps. His name was Theo Calden, 16 years old. A quiet boy with serious eyes. He didn't say much. But when Dan brought him food for the first time and Theo saw a real egg, he started crying. Silently. Without a sound. Tears simply streamed down his cheeks. Mira hugged him and began to cry too. Dan went out and waited outside. There are some things outsiders shouldn't have to witness. By the end of the first month after meeting Mira, Dan had 3 shards. His first one. The second one with the ruins and tools. And Mira's shard. A rope bridge spanned the gap between the first and second shards. He strung a second one between the second shard and Mira's shard. The total length of the rope lines was nearly 600 meters. Dan began building condensers on each fragment. The same system. Strips of fabric on sloped surfaces with drainage into a recess. But now, with the ancient tools, he could do it more precisely, carving channels into the stone. Adjust the angles precisely. Each condenser yielded 4 to 5 liters per day. 3 condensers on 3 fragments. 15 liters a day for 3 people. Enough. Mira turned out to be exactly who she said she was, a cartographer. And not just any cartographer. She possessed a visual memory that Dan had only ever seen in movies. 1 flight in a glider, 20 minutes in the air, and she could draw a map of what she'd seen with an accuracy of 10 meters. Without any tools, no ruler, just from memory. Dan gave her some charcoal and a flat stone. She drew for 3 hours. When she finished, a map of the nearest shards lay before him. 24 objects with approximate distances and elevations marked. Each shard had a distinct shape. Each had its own features. On one, she marked that she'd seen greenery. On another, something shiny. On a third, a dark chasm resembling a cave. Dan looked at the map and didn't see rocks. He saw a network. Roots, nodes, air currents between them. He saw how it all could be connected. One evening, they were sitting by a bowl of water on the second fragment. Theo was sleeping in the shelter. Mira was drawing something in her notebook, or rather on a flat rock that served as her notebook. Dan asked what she was drawing. She turned the stone toward him. It was him, on the glider, in flight. A view from below, a silhouette against the clouds. Dan said the glider looked better in the drawing than it did in real life. Mira replied that he did too. It was the first joke he heard in this world. He laughed. She smiled. The second event that changed the situation was the 5th shard. Dan found it during the 3rd week of reconnaissance flights. It was large, almost round, with a flat surface on top, and with people. 2 men, both bearded, both in rags. Both looked up at him with an expression he was already coming to recognize, a mixture of horror and hope. The first was a former ship's carpenter named Garth, exiled 3 years ago for stealing from the royal arsenal. A huge man with hands the size of shovels. He'd survived because he was too stubborn to die. He ate bugs and roots. He drank dew collected in his beard. When Dan landed, Garth stared at the glider for a long time. Then he said that thing could fly. Dan confirmed it. Garth was silent for a moment. Then he said he needed to see it one more time. Dan took off. He circled over the shard. Then he landed again. Garth stood motionless. Then he said 2 words. "Show me again." Dan did. The second man on the shard was quieter. His name was Wren, a former clerk at some provincial court, exiled for refusing to sign a false verdict. A small, gaunt man with precise movements. He didn't say anything when he saw the glider. He just sat down on a rock and covered his face with his hands. Dan didn't touch him. He brought some water and set it down nearby. He returned an hour later. Ren was drinking the water in small sips and had stopped crying. He asked if there were any other people. Dan said there were. 3. Himself. A female cartographer. Her younger brother. Ren nodded. Then he asked if he could join them too. Dan didn't understand the question. Ren clarified. Could he be with the others too? Dan said he didn't need to ask for permission. Ren was silent for a moment. Then he said that the last time he was with people, they had sentenced him. Dan didn't know what to say. He simply held out his hand. Ren shook it. The handshake was weak, but it was a handshake. By the end of the second month, there were 5 of them. Dan, Mira, Theo, Garth, and Ren. 5 people on 4 fragments connected by rope bridges and a single glider. Dan assigned each of them a task, not because he wanted to be in charge, but because chaos kills faster than hunger. Mira handled the mapping. She flew with him in the glider as an observer and drew up the map. Theo, still weak but already able to walk, kept an eye on the capacitors. Garth worked with wood and stone. The shipwright's hands proved invaluable. He could do in an hour what took Dan a whole day. Ren kept records. He counted supplies. He noted the weather. He kept a log. The small, wiry scribe turned out to be the one this community needed most of all. He created order, and order created hope. One evening, Dan sat on the edge of the second shard and watched the sunset. Mira approached and sat down beside him. She was silent for a moment. Then she said that for a year and a half she had been watching the sky through a telescope. She had seen other exiles die on their rocks, one after another. They simply stopped moving. First, they stopped looking for food. Then they stopped drinking. Then they lay down and never got up again. She saw them from above. Tiny, motionless figures on the gray rock. And there was nothing she could do. She said that when she saw smoke on his shard, she didn't believe it. When she saw movement, she decided it was a bird. When she saw a wing, she thought she'd gone mad. And when he landed in front of her and held out the water, she realized one thing, that all this time she hadn't been dying of thirst or hunger. She had been dying because she was alone. Dan was silent. He looked up at the sky. Then he said she wouldn't be alone anymore. He said it simply, without any drama. As a matter of fact, Mira didn't say anything in reply. But the next morning, Dan found a neatly folded map in his shelter. A complete one, a detailed one. All the fragments that Mira had seen over a year and a half of observation. Dozens of locations, with notes. Saw water here. Saw greenery here. Here she saw movement that could have been a person. The map was signed with a single word, thank you. Mira's map changed everything. Dan spread it out on the surface of the second shard next to the bowl and studied it for 3 days. Dozens of objects, each with notes. Size, height, presence of greenery, presence of water, possible presence of people. Mira marked with a question mark those shards where she'd seen movement but couldn't identify it for sure. There were 7 of them. 7 stones where someone else might still be alive. Dan decided to fly over each one. But first, he had to solve a problem that was becoming more urgent with each passing day. The glider could carry only 1 person, 2 at most, if the second person was light. Theo weighed very little and could fly as a passenger, but the glider wouldn't be able to lift Garth. Garth weighed as much as 2 Dans, and that was no exaggeration. Rope crossings were slow and dangerous. Garth had crossed one of them once and said he'd never set foot on that rope again in his life, not because he was afraid, but because the rope creaked pitifully under his weight and sagged so low that it seemed like it would snap at any second. They needed a different mode of transportation, something bigger, with a higher load capacity, safer. Dan thought about it for 3 days. He drew, he calculated, he erased, he drew again, and he came to the only solution that made sense: an airship. Not a real airship, of course. Not the kind he'd designed in his past life, with an aluminum frame and a gas-tight envelope. A dirigible. A balloon with controllable lift. Hot air is lighter than cold air. Everyone knows that, but few people realize how much hot air it takes to lift a person. A lot. A whole lot. The envelope would have to be enormous, and light, and airtight. With fabric made from plant fibers, this was almost impossible. Almost. Dan remembered the sap from succulent plants. 3 layers made the fabric nearly airtight. But for an aerostat, something better was needed. 5 layers. 6. 7. He experimented for 2 days. 7 layers produced a fabric that didn't let any air through at all. But it became stiff and heavy. 6 layers were a compromise. Almost airtight. Light enough. flexible enough to sew the envelope. Sew, that was the key word. He made a needle from an ancient composite material, a thin one, sharp, with an eye drilled with another tool. Thread made from the same plant fibers, but the thinnest ones. He didn't know how to sew, but Mira did. Her mother had been a seamstress before her father was arrested. Mira remembered. When Dan explained to her what needed to be done, she looked at him for a long time. Then she asked if he meant to say that he was going to lift a hot air bag into the air and fly in it. Dan confirmed it. Mira was silent for a moment. Then she said he was crazy. Then she picked up a needle and began to sew. She sewed for 2 weeks. Dan helped. Garth cut the fabric to size. Theo applied the sap to the finished panels. Ren kept track of material usage. The 5 of them worked like a well-oiled machine. The shell turned out to be nearly spherical in shape, with a diameter of about 4 meters and a volume of approximately 33 cubic meters. Dan did the math in his head. With a temperature difference of 100 degrees between the air inside and outside, the lift would be about 10 kilograms per cubic meter. 33 cubic meters equals 330 kilograms of lift, minus the weight of the envelope, minus the weight of the frame, minus the weight of the basket. That leaves about 150 to 200 kilograms of payload. 1 person, or 2 light people, or 1 heart, just barely. The heat source was the next problem. On the ground, hot air balloons used propane burners. Dan didn't have any propane, but he did have dry tree branches with silvery bark. He conducted an experiment. The wood burned well. It was hot, almost smokeless, and it burned for a very long time. A small fire made from 3 branches burned for 2 hours. That was unusual. The trees on the shards were no ordinary trees. Their wood possessed a density and heat of combustion that Dan had never encountered before. He assembled a burner from a stone bowl. A hole in the bottom provided draft. Inside was a grid of fin rods made of an ancient composite material. On top was a funnel directing hot air into the shell. The design was crude, but it worked. The first test was conducted at dawn, without a passenger. Dan tied the shell to a rock with a long rope. He lit the burner and waited. The shell lay on the stone as a shapeless heap. Then it began to stir, then to rise, then to take on a rounded shape. Hot air filled it from within, and it grew like a living creature. Garth took 3 steps back. Theo opened his mouth. Mira didn't move. She just watched. The envelope rose and pulled on the rope. Dan checked the lift force. The envelope was pulling upward with a force of about 20 kilograms. Not enough. More heat was needed. He added firewood to the burner. The temperature inside rose. The lifting force increased. 30 kilograms. 50. 70. The rope tightened like a string. The shell was tearing toward the sky. Dan tied a stone to the rope. Then a second, a third, a fourth. By the 8th stone, the lifting force had stabilized. He weighed the stones afterward. The total weight was about 160 kilograms. He had miscalculated slightly. 160, not 200. But that was enough. More than enough for 1 person. Hart had woven the basket from thin branches in 2 days. Rough but sturdy, with 4 suspension points. Dan added a very simple control system, a damper on the burner. Opening it wider meant more heat and lift. Closing it meant cooling down and descending. He hadn't come up with anything for horizontal movement. The balloon flew wherever the wind took it. But Dan knew the wind. He read the air currents. He knew at what time of day and at what altitude the wind blew in which direction. It wasn't control. It was a partnership with the sky. He made the first manned flight himself. Because there was no one else to entrust with the first flight. He climbed into the basket. He checked the burner. He checked the ropes. He shouted to Hart to untie the ropes. Hart untied them. The balloon rose, slowly, smoothly, without any jerks. Not like a glider that lurches and shakes, like an elevator. A slow, crewing elevator that smelled of burnt wood and lifted you up into the sky. Dan rose 50 meters above Oskalok. He looked down. 4 figures were looking up. Hart stood with his legs apart like a sailor on deck. Theo was holding on to Mira. Ren was writing something in his stone notebook. Dan waved at them. They waved back. He rose higher. 100 meters. 200. At this altitude, the wind was blowing eastward. The balloon began to drift. Slowly. Dan didn't resist. He was flying. To the east were 3 fragments from Mira's map. 2 small ones and 1 medium-sized one. On the medium-sized one, she had marked a question mark. Possibly people. He reached it in 40 minutes. Landing the balloon turned out to be more difficult than landing a glider. He had to calculate the exact moment to close the flap. Too early, and it wouldn't make it. Too late, and it would be carried right past. He closed the valve 100 meters from the fragment. The balloon began to descend. The wind carried it straight toward the landing site. 20 meters. 10. 5. The basket struck a rock. The balloon bounced. Dan grabbed a ledge. He held on. He tied a rope to the rock. The balloon deflated. It lay flat on the ground. Dan climbed out of the basket. There were no people on this Oskalok, but there were traces. A stone wall was scratched in lines. Someone had been counting the days. There were 134 lines. Next to the lines lay a pile of rags. Dan bent down. Not rags. Clothes. Next to the clothes, bones gleamed white. A person had lived here for 134 days and didn't live to see the 135th. Dan stood over the bones. He took off the hat he didn't have. He simply bowed his head. Then he explored the shard thoroughly. He found a few more fragments useful for building. He found a water source in a deep crevice. And he found something unexpected. In a niche behind a stone ledge lay a stack of plates. Thin. Smooth. Made of the same ancient material. But symbols were engraved on them. Not letters. Not numbers. Diagrams. Dan picked up the first plate and held it up to the light. It depicted a structure. An elongated fuselage, a gondola beneath it. On the sides, something resembling propellers. Inside the hull, a system of partitions. It was a blueprint, an ancient blueprint for a flying machine. Not a balloon, not a glider. An airship, with a rigid frame, with gas compartments, with a propulsion system. Dan went through the plates one by one. There were 12 of them. Each showed a separate structural component: the frame, the envelope, the control system, the engines, and the gas cells for controlling lift. He didn't understand all the symbols, but he understood the language of engineering: shape, proportion, joints, cross-sections. These weren't decorations or religious texts, the kind people loved to hang in ruins. This was technical documentation. Thousands of years ago, someone had built airships. Real airships, filled with gas lighter than air, capable of controlled flight, with a payload capacity that allowed them to carry dozens of people. And that someone had left behind blueprints, like instructions, like a message. Dan sat on a rock next to the bones of an unknown exile, holding in his hands 12 plates that were worth more than all the gold of the 5 kingdoms combined. The man who had lain here. 134 days. He sat right next to the answer and didn't know it. He couldn't have known, because to read these blueprints, one had to be an engineer. One had to know what lift was, what gas volume was, what an aerodynamic profile was. You had to see not patterns, but a machine in those lines. Dan saw it. He placed the plates in the balloon's basket. He added more firewood to the burner. He waited for the evening wind blowing westward back toward his shards. And he flew home. He flew and thought. 12 plates. 12 answers to questions he hadn't yet had time to ask. Gas is lighter than air. He didn't know what kind of gas the ancients used, but he knew that hydrogen could be obtained from water through primitive electrolysis. Electrolysis requires an electric current. An electric current requires a generator. A generator requires energy. And energy was all around him, in the updrafts, in the wind, in the temperature difference between the sunlit and shaded sides of the fragments. A chain of solutions unfolded in his mind like a blueprint. Each link led to the next. Each step opened up 10 new possibilities. He landed on his shard after the sun had already set. Mira was waiting for him with a lantern, or rather, with a burning twig stuck in a crevice between the rocks. Dan showed her the plates. She looked at them for a long time. Then she said she'd seen similar symbols on the walls of one of the distant shards, the one she couldn't reach. Dan said that now he could, that soon he'd be able to reach any shard. Mira looked at him, then at the plates, then at the airship settling behind him. And for the first time since they'd met, she smiled so that the corners of her eyes twitched. Not a polite smile, not a grateful one, a genuine one. Dan realized that this was the beginning, not of survival, not of salvation, of construction. Dan laid out the 12 plates in the square of the second fragment and studied them for 4 days. Every line, every symbol, every connection. The ancient engineers worked differently than he was used to. Their drawings were both technical and artistic. The lines were smooth. The proportions were precise to the millimeter. But behind the beauty lay a rigid logic. Dan could see it. The airship's frame consisted of longitudinal spars and transverse bulkheads, all made of the same ancient composite material. Inside the frame were gas compartments. Not a single large tanks, but several separate ones. If one were damaged, the others would keep the structure aloft. It was a safety system, smart and well thought out. Thousands of years ago, someone had thought about the same thing Dan was thinking about: how not to fall. The problem was the gas. The ancients used something Dan couldn't identify from the blueprints. The symbol on the plate showed a container and a tube leading to the gas compartment, but he didn't know what was in the container. Hydrogen was the obvious choice. Light, abundant, derived from water, but dangerous. A single spark and the airship would turn into a torch. Helium would be ideal, but obtaining helium under medieval conditions was impossible. Dan chose hydrogen, not because he wanted to take a risk, but because there was no other choice. To produce hydrogen, he needed electrolysis. For electrolysis, he needed an electric current. For an electric current, he needed a generator. Dan started with the generator. The principle was simple. A conductor moves through a magnetic field, and a current is induced in it. He had a conductor. On one of the distant shards of the world, Mira had noticed a shiny surface. Dan flew there in a balloon and found a vein of metal running through the rock. Copper. Or something very similar to copper. A soft, reddish metal that could be cut with ancient tools and drawn into wire. The magnet was trickier. Dan spent a week searching. He flew over 6 shards. On the 5th, he found rock that attracted metal tools. Magnetic iron ore. Not very strong, but strong enough. He cut out 2 fist-sized pieces. He assembled a very simple generator in 3 days. A coil of copper wire, 2 magnets, an axle made of an ancient composite material, a handle for turning. You turn the handle and a current flows between the wires. Weak, unstable, but a current nonetheless. Ren turned the handle for 2 hours a day. Then Garth, then Theo. They took turns. The current flowed through the copper wires into a stone basin filled with water. Bubbles formed at the ends of the wires. Oxygen at one end, hydrogen at the other. Dan collected the hydrogen in a bag made of that same airtight fabric. The process was agonizingly slow. A day's work yielded about a liter of gas. The airship needed hundreds of cubic meters. At that rate, it would take years to fill it. Dan realized that the hand-crank generator was a dead end. He needed another source of energy, and it was right in front of him: the wind. At an altitude of 4 kilometers, the wind blew almost constantly. Strong, stable, predictable. A windmill, the simplest windmill with blades made of an ancient composite material and a generator on the axle. It spins on its own, day and night, non-stop. Dan spent 10 days building it. Garth helped with the heavy parts. Dan carved the blades to a specific profile, not flat boards, but curved surfaces that catch the wind more efficiently. 4 blades on the axle. The axle is connected to the generator via a simple gear mechanism. When the windmill started working, Garth stood there watching the spinning blades with the expression of someone witnessing a miracle. Ren recorded the date in the logbook and marked it as important. Theo asked what that sound was. The windmill was humming, low and steady, like a distant motor. Mira said that on her fragment this sound could be heard. She thought it was a new kind of bird. The wind turbine produced 10 times more current than the hand-crank generator. Electrolysis accelerated. 5 liters of hydrogen a day. Then 10 when Dan added a second coil. Then 20 when he built a second wind turbine on a neighboring fragment. But even 20 liters a day wasn't enough. The first small airship required at least 200 cubic meters, 200,000 liters. At 20 liters a day, that would take nearly 30 years. Unacceptable. Dan sat poring over the calculations and fumed. The numbers didn't add up. There wasn't enough time. There weren't enough resources. There weren't enough hands. There wasn't enough of anything. And then Mira brought him a map on which she had marked a new fragment. A large one, 2 kilometers to the north. Through her binoculars, she'd seen something strange there. Metal structures, glinting in the sun. Not stone, not wood, metal. Dan flew there the next morning. The balloon carried him on the north wind. The shard turned out to be enormous, 20 times larger than his first rock. It had 3-story buildings that had survived, wide streets, a square with 4 metal columns 10 meters high, and a workshop. Dan found it on the 2nd floor of a corner building. The door was open. Inside were workbenches. Tools lay on the workbenches, the same ones he found before, but larger. Heavier, more complex, and something else. In the far corner of the workshop, on a stone pedestal, stood a cylinder. Metal. Smooth. With a valve on top. Dan walked over to it. He tapped the side. The sound was dull. The cylinder was full. He turned the valve a quarter turn. There was a hiss. Gas. Dan closed the valve. He held a splinter up to it and opened it again for a second. The splinter didn't catch fire. Not hydrogen. He sniffed. It didn't smell of anything. A colorless, odorless gas. Lighter than air because the stream rose upward. Not hydrogen, not oxygen, not nitrogen. Helium. Dan sat down on the workshop floor. His hands were shaking. He found a helium cylinder, one that had maintained its pressure for thousands of years. Because the ancient alloy didn't let the gas escape. Because the valve was airtight. Because those who made it knew what they were doing. He searched every nook and cranny of the workshop. He found 3 more cylinders, 2 full, 1 empty. 3 full cylinders. Each held about 40 cubic meters of gas at atmospheric pressure. 120 cubic meters of helium. Not 200, but it would be enough for a first small airship. And helium doesn't burn. It doesn't explode. It's safe. Dan spent 2 days transporting the cylinders. Each weighed about 30 kilograms. The airship could carry 1 per flight. 3 flights. 6 hours of flight time. He tied the cylinder to the basket with extra ropes and prayed to gods he didn't know that the knots would hold. The knots held. When the last cylinder landed on the square of the second shard, Dan gathered everyone together. 5 people stood around the 3 metal cylinders and looked at them. Dan explained that it was gas, that it was lighter than air, that if they filled the envelope with it, it would rise without fire, without a burner, without smoke. Hart asked where this gas had come from. Dan said it had been left behind by those who live here before them. Hart was silent for a moment. Then he said that those who live here before them had been smarter. Dan agreed. Construction of the first airship began the very next day. Not a hot air balloon, a dirigible, with a frame, capable of controlled flight, with a rudder and an elevator. Dan worked from ancient blueprints. He adapted them to his own materials and dimensions. The frame was made of rods of an ancient composite material. The envelope was made of plant-based fabric. The gas compartment was inside the frame. A gondola at the bottom housed the crew and cargo. The fuselage was 8 meters long. Its diameter was 2.5 meters. The gas compartment's volume was about 100 cubic meters. The lift provided by helium allowed for a payload of about 100 kilograms after subtracting the weight of the structure. That wasn't much, but it was a controlled flight. A rudder on the tail, an elevator in the same place. 2 small sails on the sides to harness the wind. No engine. An engine was still a long way off. But the sails made it possible to fly not only downwind but also at an angle to the wind, just like a sailboat tacking. Gart built the frame. His hands, those of a ship's carpenter, proved ideal for this work. He had a feel for the material. He understood the loads. He fitted the parts with a precision that amazed Dan. Mira sewed the shell in the gas bag. Ren kept records of every component. He recorded the dimensions, the weight, and the assembly sequence. Theo was on hand to help. He carried materials and handed tools. He had grown stronger over those months. His gauntness was gone. His eyes had become clearer. He spoke little but worked nonstop. The assembly took 22 days. When the last frame rod was in place, Dan walked around the structure 3 times. He checked every joint, every connection, every seam on the envelope. Then he connected the cylinder to the gas compartment and opened the valve. Helium flowed inside. The envelope began to inflate, slowly. The airship's hull lay on the rocks and came to life. It rounded out. It stretched taut. It rose. An hour later, the airship lifted off the ground. The frame creaked. The ropes tying it to the rocks tightened. The gondola hung 0.5 meter above the surface. The airship hung in the air. Ugly. Crooked. With juice stains on the envelope. With roughly hewn frame struts. With a gondola woven from branches. But it was hanging there. Dan climbed into the gondola. He untied 1 rope. Then a second. A third. A fourth. The airship rose. Dan pulled the elevator control. The nose pitched up. It was gaining altitude. He pulled the rudder control. The airship turned to the left. Slowly. Like a ship in heavy water. But it turned. The wind caught the side sails. The airship headed northeast. Dan stood in the gondola and looked ahead. Clouds drifted beneath him. Shards hung all around. Gray, green, dark. Each one was a whole world. Each one was a possibility. Behind him, on the square, 4 people stood looking up. He heard Garth shouting something. He couldn't make out the words, but he understood from the tone. Garth was happy. For the first time in 3 years of exile, the first month of flying in the airship had changed the scale of everything. In 2 days, Dan had flown over the territory that Mira had spent a year and a half mapping. There weren't just dozens of shards, there were hundreds. They stretched for kilometers in every direction, of different sizes, at different altitudes. Some hung at an altitude of 4 kilometers above the ground. Others rose higher to 6 to 7. Still others descended lower down to 2 kilometers, almost touching the peaks of the mountain ranges. Between them flowed rivers of air. Currents so powerful that they would toss the airship tens of meters in a matter of seconds. Dan was learning to read these currents. He was learning to use them. And he was learning to fear them. On the 3rd day of his flights, he got caught in a downdraft behind a large fragment. The airship plummeted 100 meters in 30 seconds. The gondola creaked. The ropes stretched to their limit. The frame groaned. Dan jettisoned all the ballast and opened the balloon valve to add helium. The airship halted its descent 20 meters from a rocky ridge that would have sliced it in half. 20 meters. That was the difference between life and death. Dan returned to base with a pale face and trembling hands. Mira saw him and asked no questions. She simply brought him some water. He drank and sat down on a rock. An hour later, he told her what had happened. Mira listened in silence. Then she took out a map and marked the area where the incident occurred with a red symbol. The first danger zone on the map. There would be many more to come. During the first month, Dan found 11 more people, survivors on various fragments. Some were exiles like him. Others had been abandoned here by failed expeditions from years past. One man had lived on his rock for 7 years. 7 years in complete solitude. When Dan landed the airship on his shard, the old man emerged from his hiding place and stood motionless for a long time. Then he asked if Dan was real. Dan said he was. The old man walked over and touched his shoulder. Then he touched the airship. Then he sat down on a rock and started laughing. He laughed for a long time, about 10 minutes. Then he fell silent and said his name was Olmar. That he was a former astronomer, that he'd been exiled for claiming that the fragments move. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, but they do move. The court decided that was heresy. Olmar said that over 7 years of observation, he had definitively established that the fragments were indeed moving. They drift, slowly rotating around an invisible center. One full rotation takes about 20 years. Dan wrote this down. The drift of the fragments meant that the map of Mira would become outdated, that the distances between them would change, that routes would have to be recalculated. But it also meant that, over time, fragments that were currently far away would draw closer to them. New resources, new opportunities. Dan brought Olmar back to the base along with the records the old man had kept for 7 years on stone tablets in small handwriting. The records proved invaluable. Olmar had noted wind direction, time of day, and current strength, 7 years of meteorological observations. Iris would later say that this single notebook was worth an entire observatory. But Iris hadn't shown up yet. The community was growing. By the end of the 3rd month after meeting Mira, there were 16 of them. 16 people on the 7 shards, capacitors, vegetable gardens on 3 fragments where Dan had planted seeds from the fruits of trees with silvery bark, rope crossings between nearby rocks, an airship for long-distance travel. And Dan began building a second one, larger than the first, with a gas compartment volume of 200 cubic meters, with a double gondola, with a cargo compartment. For that, he needed more helium. He returned to the ancient workshop. He searched it again. He found a secret room behind a false wall. Inside were 6 more cylinders, all full. Dan stood in that room and thought about the people who had filled those cylinders thousands of years ago. They knew. They knew that someone would come. They knew he would need gas. They were preparing. But for what? The answer to that question came sooner than Dan expected. On a distant shard to the west of the Mira base, she spotted an unusual structure, a large building with a dome, undamaged, intact. Dan flew there for 2 hours against the wind, weaving between the gusts. The shard was medium-sized but entirely occupied by a single building, a circular hall with a dome made of the same ancient material. The walls were smooth. The floor was paved with patterned slabs. And there were drawings on the walls, not faded like on the other fragments, but bright and crisp, as if they'd been painted yesterday. Dan stepped inside and stopped. The drawings covered all the walls from floor to dome. These weren't paintings. They were diagrams, schematics, maps, numbers. He walked slowly around the hall, reading. The first wall showed the fragments, all of them, hundreds of them, with precise distances between them. It was a map that Mira had been compiling for months, only now was it complete and accurate. The second wall showed designs, Aircraft. Not just one type, but 10. From simple gliders to huge airships with multiple decks, each with dimensions and specifications. The third wall showed a system of cables and the connecting the fragments into a single network. Hub stations, transfer points, routes, schedules. This was a transportation infrastructure, not for 10 people, for thousands. The fourth wall. Dan stood in front of the fourth wall and couldn't move. It showed the land, a bird's eye view, a continent, 5 kingdoms, rivers, mountains, cities, and underground. A cross-section revealed layers of soil, rock, deep cavities, and in the deepest cavities, something enormous, coiled up, sleeping. Lines radiating upward from this creature or mechanism, or whatever it was that had no name, through the rock, through the soil, to the surface, and further, upward, toward the shards. Next to the image were numbers. Dan didn't know the local number system, but he saw a pattern, a repeating cycle, and an arrow pointing to a mark. Next to the mark was a number. Dan took out Olmar's motes. He compared the number systems. He recalculated. He counted for a long time, 3 times. The result didn't change. Whatever lay dormant below was awakening in a cycle. The last awakening occurred about 5,000 years ago. The next one would be in 7 years, give or take a few months. Dan sat down on the floor of the hall and sat there in silence for a long time. The dome overhead picked up sounds and amplified them. He could hear his own breathing, his heartbeat, and the quiet hum of the wind outside. The shards hadn't been lifted into the sky by a catastrophe. They had been built, on purpose, as a refuge, as an evacuation system. An ancient civilization knew it was coming. It built a refuge in the sky. It lifted its people up, and still perished. Because shelters alone aren't enough. You also have to be able to save everyone. And they weren't able to save everyone. Dan thought about the 16 people on his shards, about the 5 kingdoms below, about the millions of people who lived, worked, fought, and had children, unaware that slumbering beneath them was the very thing their ancestors had fled to the sky to escape. 7 years. He stood up. He rolled up his notes. He left the hall. He boarded the airship and flew home. He was silent the whole way. When he returned, Mira asked what he had found. Dan said he had found a map, a complete map of all the shards. That was true. Not the whole truth, but the truth. He didn't say anything about the fourth wall. Not because he didn't trust Mira, but because he didn't know how to say it. How to explain to someone that the world they live in has an expiration date. That in 7 years, something will awaken down below, and that the only salvation is to be up above. On the stones in the sky, on those very rocks where criminals and heretics are exiled. He remained silent and began to count. Dan counted for 3 days. He didn't sleep. He barely ate. Mira brought him water and food. He thanked her with a nod and continued to sketch. The numbers formed a picture that sent a chill through his insides. To lift enough people into the air, they needed not dozens of shards, but hundreds. Not a single airship, but a fleet. Not a community of 16 people, but a city. And all this would take 7 years. Or rather, 6 years and 10 months. Dan set down his charcoal pencil. He rubbed his face with his hands, and he made a decision that would determine everything that followed. He wouldn't talk about what was sleeping down below. To anyone. Not now. If he told the people here, they'd be frightened. If he told the people down below, panic would break out. Wars over spots on the shards. Chaos. Death. He would build. Quickly. A lot. And explain it with anything but the truth. Trade, expansion, progress, anything, but not the truth. He knew it wasn't fair. He knew that one day he'd have to tell them, but not now. Right now, he had to build. The second airship was ready in 3 weeks, bigger than the first, more spacious. It could carry 3 people and 100 kilograms of cargo. Dan began using it to transport people, to move resources, to connect the shards. He chose the central shard as his base, the largest one with the workshop. He named it Port, not a city, not a fortress. Port, a place where people dock. Garth moved his workshop to Port. Ren organized a warehouse and began keeping track of everything they had. Olmar took the top floor of the corner building and set up an observatory. Mira moved her maps there as well. Theo worked in the vegetable gardens, which expanded with each passing week. Dan built. Every day. From dawn till dusk. The third airship. The fourth condenser. The second workshop, rope crossings. He worked like a man possessed and people noticed it. Mira was the first to ask what was going on. Dan said he wanted to get as much done as possible while the weather held. That was only half the truth. The weather really was good. The season of calm. The perfect time for construction. But the real reason lay in the numbers staring him in the face. 6 years and 10 months. By the end of the 4th month after meeting Mira, 23 people were living in Porto. Dan knew each one by name. He knew their stories. He knew why they'd been exiled. He knew what they were capable of. And he assigned tasks with a precision that surprised everyone but himself. To him, each person was not a unit of labor, but an element of the system, like a cog in a machine, each in its place, each irreplaceable. It was then that Yuna Sohee appeared. Dan was piloting the 3rd airship south toward the Shard, which Mira had marked as a possible source of iron ore. The flight took an hour and a half. He was flying at an altitude of 500 meters above the archipelago when he heard a knock from the cargo hold. Dan brought the airship to a halt mid-flight. He pulled out a knife. He opened the cargo compartment hatch. From beneath the bags of tools, angry, dark eyes were staring at him. A girl, young, dirty, wearing men's clothes that were 3 sizes too big for her. She climbed out of the compartment and stood before him, her fists clenched. Dan asked who she was and how she'd gotten onto the airship. She replied that her name was Yuna, that she climbed aboard at night while everyone was asleep, that she needed to get as far away as possible from where she'd been before. Dan asked where she was from. Yuna said she was from the ground. She explained that a week ago she had run away from home. She had climbed onto one of the shards using a rope ladder she found hanging from a lower rock. She'd lived on that shard for 4 days until she spotted the airship. Dan asked why she had run away. Yuna remained silent. Then she said that her father wanted to marry her off to a merchant's son, that she was a blacksmith, not a merchant's wife, that her hands were made for a hammer, not a spinning wheel, and that if he was going to send her back down, he might as well just throw her overboard because she wouldn't be going back anyway. Dan looked at her, thin, hungry, angry, and absolutely serious. He said he wasn't going to throw anyone overboard, and asked if she could really work with metal. Yuna looked at him as if he were an idiot. Then she walked over to the nearest support beam of the frame. She tapped it with her finger, tilted her head, tapped it again, ran her fingernail along the surface, and she said there was a microcrack in that beam, right here, 5 centimeters from the joint. If it isn't replaced, it'll snap in 2 or 3 months. Dan checked. The crack was exactly where she pointed, as thin as a hair. He hadn't noticed it during his inspection, but she detected it by ear. In a minute, Dan silently turned the airship back toward the port. When they landed, he led her to the main workshop. He handed her the keys. He told her she was in charge here. If anyone argued, he said, they should send them to him. Yuma stood in the middle of the workshop and looked at the tools. Ancient chisels, hammers, saws, workbenches. She walked over to a workbench, ran her hand over the surface. Then she picked up a hammer, tossed it in the air, caught it, felt its weight and balance. And for the first time since they'd met, she stopped frowning. Yuna didn't just smile. Yuna beamed. She worked like a woman possessed, from morning till night, and she worked so intently that Garth, who had spent 20 years in shipyards, stood nearby and watched in silence. She sensed the material. She didn't understand it. She sensed it. With her hands, her fingers, the tips of her fingernails. She knew when to press harder and when to ease up. She knew when the metal was ready to bend and when it would break. She knew this without calculations or formulas. She just knew. In the first week, she repaired a crack in the frame of the 3rd airship. She made 4 new tools from the fragments of an ancient composite, and she redesigned the gondola suspension system on the 1st airship, making it twice as strong. Dan watched for work and saw what Yuna herself did not yet understand. She wasn't just a blacksmith. She was an engineer. Without an education. Without theory. But an engineer nonetheless. She solved problems that he formulated on paper, and she solved them with her hands. Once he showed her a blueprint for a new frame joint, a complex one with 3 attachment points. Yuna looked at the blueprint. Then she took a piece of material and within an hour made a part that was better than the blueprint. Dan asked how. Yuna shrugged and said that this was the right way to do it, that she could see how the stress traveled through the material, that as she made it as shown in the drawing, the load would be distributed unevenly. But this way, it would be distributed across the entire surface. Dan took her part. He examined it. She was right. The load distribution was perfect. He smiled and said she needed to learn how to calculate. Yuna said that calculating was boring. Dan said that falling from a height of 4 kilometers was boring because she hadn't calculated the load. Yuna fought for a second, then she said she was ready to learn how to calculate. From that day on, Dan taught her every evening: math, physics, structural mechanics. He explained things simply without formulas, using his fingers, stones, and pieces of wood. Yuna picked it up instantly. What he'd spent a semester learning at the university, she mastered in a week, because she didn't need theory. She just needed to put names to what she already knew through her hands. By the end of the 5th month, port was beginning to take shape. 27 people, 3 airships, 10 fragments connected by ropes and air routes, 2 full-scale vegetable gardens, a workshop run by Yuna, Olmar's observatory, Mira's mapping station, Ren's warehouse. And the first problem Dan couldn't handle on his own. People started arguing. The argument began over a trifle. Garth wanted to set up a new workbench in the southern part of the workshop. Yuna said that the southern part was her territory and the workbench would get in the way. Garth replied that the workshop belonged to everyone. Yuna replied that Dan had said she was in charge here. Garth said that Dan wasn't a king and couldn't hand out territory. Yuna said that if Garth didn't move his workbench, she'd move it herself, along with Garth. Dan arrived just as they were standing face to face, neither willing to back down. Garth towered over Yuna like a tower. Yuna clutched her hammer and looked up at Garth without a trace of fear. Dan resolved the issue in 5 minutes. He divided the workshop into zones. Yuna got the southern section for precision work on small parts. Garth got the northern section for rough work on large components. The central section remained shared. They both agreed. But the problem wasn't the workbench. The problem was that 27 people were living together and they had no rules. Dan built capacitors and airships but forgot to build the most important thing: order for the people. Ren came to see him that evening. He sat down next to him. He was silent for a moment. Then he said that he was a former court clerk, that he's seen what happens when people live without rules. First, minor quarrels, then major ones, then bloodshed. Dan asked what he was proposing. Ren took out his stone tablet on which 12 points were inscribed in small, neat handwriting. He had worked on them for 3 days. 12 simple rules. Everyone works. Everyone eats their fair share. Disputes are settled by a council of 3 people chosen by vote. Theft is punished by a week's exclusion from the communal table. Violence is punished by banishment. No one gives orders except in an emergency. Dan read them. He looked at Ren. He asked who, in his opinion, should be on the council. Ren said that everyone should decide, by vote. They held the meeting the next day. 27 people gathered in Port Square, the first meeting in the history of this place. Dan read the rules aloud. He explained each one. He asked if there were any objections. There were many objections. 3 hours of debate. Some wanted stricter punishments. Some wanted milder ones. Some didn't want any rules at all. One of the newcomers, named Hart, a former soldier, said that in the army, order is maintained by one person, the commander. That one person is needed to decide everything. Yuna said she'd already seen what happens when one person decides everything. Her father had made all her decisions for her whole life. She'd flown here to escape that. Mira spoke quietly but loud enough for everyone to hear. She said that Dan had saved all their lives, each and every one of them, personally, that he could decide anything and no one had the right to object. But that Dan doesn't want to decide alone, because he's smarter than those who want to. Silence fell. Then Garth grunted and said the girl was right. They voted. 3 people were elected to the council: Rena for fairness, Miru for her intelligence, and Garth because everyone respected him and feared him a little. Dan didn't join the council, on purpose. He said he was a builder, not a judge. That if he needed to decide something, he'd come to the council like everyone else. Some didn't understand. Hart shook his head. Olmar smiled. Yuna looked at Dan with a long look and said nothing. The rules didn't take effect right away. The first 2 weeks were tough. The arguments continued. The council met every evening. Ren kept the minutes with the precision he honed over years in court. Mira listened to both sides and found solutions that satisfied everyone. Hart stood silently and occasionally spoke a single word that ended the discussion. After a month, the arguments became less frequent. After 2 months, they almost stopped. People got used to it. People accepted the order. Not because they were forced to, but because the order worked. It was during this period of calm that Iris Wayland-Cure arrived. She flew in on a hot air balloon. A small one, a crooked one, with a silk envelope and a wicker basket. The balloon had been made on the ground, poorly made. The envelope leaked hot air. The burner smoked. The basket creaked with every gust of wind. But Iris rose 4 kilometers in this marvel and found the port. Dan saw her balloon from afar, a tiny dot rising from behind the clouds. He steered the airship toward her. He flew within 100 meters. He saw a woman in the basket, wearing a tattered dress with disheveled hair. She was standing equipped. She was holding the burner's rope with one hand. With the other, she was clutching a stack of books to her chest. Dan brought the airship closer. He shouted for her to throw the rope. Iris looked at him. She looked at the airship, at the frame, at the envelope, at the controls. And the first thing she said wasn't "thank you" or "help me." She said the rudder angle was wrong, that at that angle the airship would yaw in a crosswind, that the rudder axis needed to be shifted 3 degrees to the right. Dan silently tossed her a rope. She tied her balloon to his airship and climbed into the gondola, still clutching the books to her chest. They flew to the port in silence. Iris looked around at the shards, at the rope bridges, at the capacitors, at the vegetable gardens, at the people working in the square. When the airship landed, she stepped out of the gondola and stood motionless for a minute. Then she turned to Dan and said that she was a former court meteorologist, that she'd been fired for inaccurate forecasts, that she'd come to offer her services. Dan asked how inaccurate her forecasts had been. Iris paused. Then she said they were accurate, just not in the format the court preferred. The court wanted flowery phrasing. The sun favors His Majesty's journey. The wind brings good fortune to the royal fleet. But she would say, there's an 80% chance of rain tomorrow. The court didn't like that. Probabilities didn't fit into a worldview where the king is always right. Dan said that probabilities are valued here, highly valued, because the lives of everyone who flies depend on the accuracy of the forecast. For the first few weeks, Iris kept her distance. She considered Dan an upstart, an uneducated man who had accidentally learned to fly. She didn't understand his calculations, not because they were complicated, but because they were different, not the kind she was used to. She had been taught to describe the sky with metaphors. The wind rages, the clouds mourn, the sun is gracious. Dan described the sky with numbers: airflow velocity, temperature at altitude, humidity, pressure. They were different languages describing the same thing. The turning point came 3 weeks later. Dan was preparing for a long flight west. He needed a 2-day forecast. He asked Iris to tell him what she thought. Iris began with her usual phrasing. Atmospheric conditions are favorable. Dan stopped her. He said he didn't need the standard phrasing. He said he needed to know what she felt, simply, in her own words, without formulas or metaphors, what the sky was telling her. Iris fell silent. She was silent for a long time. Then she walked to the edge of the shard. She looked east, at the clouds, at the horizon, and she said she could feel the cold coming from there, that the air smelled different, that in a day a strong wind would come from the east, very strong, so strong that flying would be impossible, and in 2 days the wind would die down and there would be a 6-hour window. Then the wind would return. Dan took notes. He postponed the flight for 2 days. A storm hit a day later. The wind was so strong that it tore the fabric off one of the condensers. The airships were pressed against the rocks and tied down. People took shelter. 2 days later, the storm subsided. The window opened at exactly 6 o'clock, just as Iris had said. Dan made the flight and returned before the wind picked up again. He went to Iris and brought her a notebook, a real notebook, made from sheets that Wren had crafted from wood pulp and plant-based glue. Rough sheets. Uneven, but real paper. Dan told her to write whatever she wanted, that they'd figure out how to use it on their own. Iris took the notebook, opened it, ran her finger across the page, then closed it, pressed it to her chest, and began to cry. Quietly, silently. Tears streamed down her cheeks and she didn't wipe them away. Dan left. He waited outside. 10 minutes later, Iris came out with dry eyes and said she needed an observatory, with a window facing east, because the morning light helps her think better. Dan nodded, and he built her an observatory with a window facing east. The first contact with Earth took place in the 6th month. Dan had been preparing for this for a long time. He knew that sooner or later he would have to go down. Up there, the most important thing was missing. Iron. Real iron for tools and fasteners. Grain seeds. Salt. Leather for belts and suspension systems. Fabric. All the things that cost a penny on Earth but were priceless in the sky. The problem wasn't the descent. Descending in the airship was easy. Open the valve. Let some of the helium escape. Head down. The problem was what would happen after the descent. Dan was an exile, officially dead. The appearance of an exile on the ground was a crime. It was punishable by death, a real execution. Not exile to a rock, a noose around his neck. He thought about it for a week. Then he decided he shouldn't descend into the city but toward the trade route, at night, in a remote spot. And not to just anyone, but to one specific person, to a merchant. Mira helped. She knew the trade routes. She knew which caravans traveled which routes. She knew the names. One of them stuck in her memory. A merchant named Volt Drayan, a mid-level trader. He transported salt and fabrics between the two kingdoms. As honest as a merchant can be in a world where everyone steals. Mira knew him because he had once transported goods for her father. And her father had said one thing about him that Mira remembered. He said that Volt was the only merchant you could trust with your back turned. Dan chose a moonless night. He loaded the airship with goods for trade. He didn't have much to offer. A few fragments of an ancient composite material. They were useless without the tools to process them, but they looked unusual, beautiful, like jewelry. 5 crystals found in deep cracks within one of the shards, transparent, bluish, hard as diamond. And the most valuable item of all, a map. A map of the land compiled from above. No cartographer in the world could achieve such precision. Rivers are visible from source to mouth, mountain passes, hidden valleys. Any merchant would pay a fortune for such a map. Mira had drawn 3 copies. Each took her months of work. Dan descended for 4 hours, slowly, carefully, letting the helium escape little by little. Clouds enveloped the airship like wet gray cotton wool, and they parted. Below lay the earth, dark, vast, alive. Dan saw lights, distant, flickering, villages, cities, roads. A world that went about its business, unaware that 4 kilometers above it, people were learning to fly. He found the trade route using the landmarks Mira had given him. A wide road along the river. Wagons stood on the shoulder. The caravan had stopped for the night. Dan landed the airship in a field behind a hill. He tied it to a tree. He covered the hull with branches and burlap he found on one of the shards. In the darkness, the airship became a hill, just another mound in the field. He walked over to the caravan. He recognized Volta Drayan from Mira's description, a large man with a red beard and a booming voice. He was sitting by the campfire, apart from the others, counting something in a book by the light of an oil lamp. Dan approached and sat down across from him. Volt looked up. He stared at the stranger in strange clothes, with a weather-beaten face and calloused hands. He reached for the knife at his belt. Dan said he'd come to trade, that he had goods Volt had never seen before, and a map worth more than his entire caravan. Volt didn't take his hand off the knife. He asked who he was. Dan told the truth. He said he was from the sky. Volt was silent for 10 seconds. Then he said that if this was a joke, it was a bad one. Dan took a crystal out of his bag. He placed it on the ground between them. The crystal caught the light of the campfire and glowed blue. Volt looked at the crystal. He looked at Dan, then at the crystal again. He picked it up. He turned it over in his fingers, and from the look on his face, Dan could tell that the merchant had never seen anything like it. Volt asked how many of these he had. Dan said 5. Volt asked what he wanted. Dan unfolded the list. Iron, seeds, salt, leather, cloth, ropes, tools, nails. Volt read the list. His expression changed. He looked up and said that the list looked like supplies for a colony. Dan said that was exactly what it was, supplies for a colony. Volt was silent for a long time. Then he asked if there were any other people up there. Dan said there were. Volt asked how many. Dan said there were enough to make trade worthwhile. Volt leaned back and gazed at the stars. Then he said that his whole life he'd been leading caravans along the same roads. He paid tolls to every baron. He put up with bandits. He watched kings wage war while merchants paid for their wars. And now here he was, sitting in a field, talking to a man who claimed to live on a flying rock. He said that either the world had gone mad or he had, and that in either case he found it fascinating. They traded until dawn. Volt appraised the crystals. He looked at the map and couldn't tear his eyes away for a long time. Then he looked up and said that no such map existed, that no human could see the earth from above. Dan said he could. Volt was silent for a moment. Then he said he'd give everything on the list for the map, and he add something of his own, because such a commodity couldn't be valued in coins. Dan said he didn't need coins, that what he needed was silence. that no one should know where the goods came from or where they went, that if rumors reached the kings or the church, the trade would end. Volt nodded. He understood. A merchant who talks is a dead merchant. He said he would keep quiet, not out of fear, out of curiosity, because until now, heaven had only let the dead into its presence. But Dan was alive, and if the heavens let the living in, it meant something had changed in the world. And Volt wanted to be part of that change. They agreed on the place and time for their next meeting. In a month, in the same field. Dan made his way back up before dawn, with a load that weighed almost as much as he did. Iron, salt, seeds, a coil of real rope, 10 meters of fabric, a sack of nails. When he landed at the gate and unloaded all of this onto the square, people stood and watched. Yuna was the first to approach the iron. She picked up a piece, tossed it up, caught it. She looked at Dan and said that now she could build for real. Garth picked up the bag of nails, opened it. He poured a handful into his palm. He looked at them as if they were gold. Because 4 kilometers above the ground, nails were more valuable than gold. Mira took the seeds. She ran them through her fingers. Wheat, rye, peas, onions. She held out a handful to Theo. Theo took them and ran toward the vegetable gardens. Ren recorded every item in the log. The date, the quantity. The source. He made a note. Skyport's first trade transaction. Dan stood to the side and watched his people. 27 people holding items from the ground in their hands. Iron and seeds, simple things. But for people who had lived on rocks in the sky for half a year, these weren't just things. They were a connection to the world below, to the life they'd lost, to the hope they were finding. And Dan thought about what he couldn't say out loud. That in 6.5 years, it wouldn't be them who needed that connection, but those down below. That these seeds and this iron were the beginning of something much greater. That he wasn't building a trading post. He was building an ark. It's just that for now, he was the only one who knew it. Trade with Volt took place every month, without a hitch, without unnecessary words. Dan would descend to the agreed-upon spot. He'd leave the crystals and maps. He'd pick up the iron and supplies. Volt didn't ask questions. He didn't bring extra people. He didn't try to track where the airship was flying. He was the perfect partner. But nothing perfect lasts forever. In the 4th month of trading, Volt showed up at the meeting with news. He said rumors had started circulating. Not about Dan. Not about the port. About the crystals. A jeweler in the capital of the kingdom of Kernmore had bought one of the crystals from a middleman. He showed it to the royal treasurer. The treasurer showed it to the king. The king asked where it came from. The jeweler didn't know. The middleman didn't know. But the trail led back to Volt. Not yet, anyway, but it will. Volt said they had 2, maybe 3 months left before someone started digging in earnest. Dan nodded. He'd been expecting this. Not this soon, but he'd been expecting it. He returned to port and convened a council. For the first time, he spoke about the trade in Earth. Not everything, but enough. That they had a supply route. That this route was under threat. That word of the port would soon get out. Ren asked what that meant. Dan said it meant they'd come for them. First with questions, then with offers, then with weapons. Mira unfolded a map. She pointed out the 5 kingdoms below. Each one would like to control the skies. Each one would kill for a monopoly on air trade. Garth asked if they could defend themselves. Dan said they could. Not with weapons. With altitude. No army in the world can rise 4 kilometers. They don't have the technology. They don't have the knowledge. The only way to reach port is by airship. And only Dan builds airships. For now, only Dan. But that won't last forever either. Sooner or later, someone down there will steal the blueprints, bribe a craftsman, copy the design. And then a real war will begin. Dan said they might have a year's head start. 1 year to become so indispensable that fighting them will be less profitable than trading with them. Yuna asked how. Dan smiled, and he explained the plan. Air trade routes. Regular flights between the kingdoms. Across the sky. No tariffs. No barons at every crossroads. No bandits. A caravan traveling by land from Kernmore to Solaris takes 3 months. An airship would make the trip in 2 days. A 3-month journey compressed into 2 days. This isn't just convenience. It's a revolution. Whoever controls the skies controls trade. Whoever controls trade controls the economy. Whoever controls the economy has no need for an army. Yuna said that this would require a lot of airships. Dan said they'd need 20. Yuna did the math in her head. 20 airships meant 20 frames. 20 hulls. 20 gas systems. At the current construction pace, that would take 3 years. Dan said they had a year. Una looked at him. Then she said that meant she needed more people. Dan began recruiting craftsmen from the ground, secretly, through Volt. The terms were simple. Anyone who wanted to work in the sky would receive housing, food, safety, and a job. Anyone who wanted to leave could leave at any time, but they weren't allowed to talk about what they'd seen. Volt found people, those who were tired of life on the ground, those who had nothing to lose, those who dreamed of something else. Within 2 months, 12 new craftsmen had made their way up to the port. Carpenters, weavers, leatherworkers, one glassblower. The community had grown to 40 people. Yuma drove the craftsmen like a sergeant. She yelled. She cursed. She hurled defective parts across the workshop. But it paid off. The airships were taking shape. The 4th, the 5th, the 6th, each better than the last, each larger, each one more reliable. Una came up with a new type of frame joint that was 3 times stronger than the old one. She didn't draw a blueprint. She made a prototype and showed it to Dan. Dan looked at it. He tested it. He calculated the load, and he said she was a genius. Una shrugged and said she wasn't a genius, just a blacksmith. Just a good blacksmith. Dan said that a good blacksmith is a genius. Una snorted, but the corners of her lips twitched upward. Li Ji-1 appeared in the 8th month. Volt brought her. He said the girl had arrived with a caravan from the eastern kingdom of Telmer, that she was a representative of the So Merchant House and had the authority to negotiate a trade agreement. Dan met her on the ground. Li stood next to Volt's wagon and smiled. She was 19, petite, meat, with a face that expressed nothing but politeness. But her eyes were calculating. Dan could see that. She was looking at the airship and calculating. Size, payload capacity, range, cost. She was calculating faster than he was speaking. Li said that the So family was interested in air transport, that they were willing to invest in exchange for priority access to routes. Dan said there would be no priority access, that the sky was open to everyone on equal terms. Li smiled and said that equal terms were also a matter for negotiation. Dan invited her to come up and see for herself. Li agreed. They ascended. 4 kilometers in 40 minutes. Li stood in the gondola and looked down. Clouds drifted beneath her feet. The earth grew smaller. Cities turned into dots. Rivers into threads. Roads into scratches. Li didn't say a word during the entire ascent. When they reached the port, she stepped out of the gondola. She looked around. A square. Workshops. Residential buildings. Capacitors. Vegetable gardens. Airships moored to the dock masts. 40 people who worked and lived 4 kilometers above the ground. Li turned to Dan and said that So's family had agreed to equal terms. Dan asked why she'd changed her mind. Li said she hadn't changed her mind. She realized one thing she hadn't understood down below, that there was no point in fighting for priority here. Because here, everything was just beginning. And whoever fights for a slice of a small pie instead of baking a big one will go hungry. Dan looked at her and thought that this girl was more dangerous than any king, because kings think about power, but she thinks about the system. Li stayed at port, officially as a representative of House So, in reality as someone who, in her first week, understood port's economy better than Ren had in half a year. She could calculate in her head faster than any abacus. She knew 6 languages. She drafted trade contracts that were beneficial to both parties. And not once did she smile genuinely. Dan noticed this on the 2nd day. She smiled at everyone, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. Once he brought her a small notebook, a real one, made from the paper Ren produced. He told her to write down everything she liked in it, not for a report, just so she wouldn't forget. Li took the notebook. She looked at it. She looked at Dan. And for the first time ever, her expression changed. Not a smile. Confusion. No one had ever asked her what she liked. No one had ever given her the right to want anything. Cassandra Rourke came to kill Dan in the 10th month. He found her on the balcony of his workshop one night. She was standing in the shadows with a knife in her hand. Professional stance. Weight on her back leg. Knife held in a reverse grip. Her face covered with a dark cloth. Dan saw her because he wasn't asleep. He was counting. As usual. Diagrams from the 4th wall. Numbers. Timelines. 6 years and 2 months until awakening. He looked up from his notes and saw the silhouette. Any normal person would have screamed, or run, or grabbed a weapon. Dan did what he always did when he didn't know what to do. He thought. 2 seconds. Then he stood up. He poured 2 cups of tea from the pitcher. He placed one in front of himself. The second one on the edge of the table, closer to her. He sat back down. and said that the tea would get cold if it sat there all night. Cass didn't move. 30 seconds. A minute. Then she put the knife away. She pulled the cloth off her face. She walked over to the table. She sat down across from him. She picked up the cup. Dan asked who the client was. He wasn't threatening. He wasn't demanding. He asked calmly, as if he were asking where she was from. Cass replied that the client was from the church, the tribunal, a man named Cardinal Valerin Ost. Dan nodded. He heard that name from Volt, the head of the church tribunal, a man who considered the shards a cursed place and anyone who tried to climb up there a heretic or a tool of the devil. Dan asked how much she'd been paid. Cass named the amount. Dan thought for a moment and said that was a small price to pay for a human life. Cass said that lives were cheap these days. War, famine, epidemics. There were more mercenaries than jobs. Dan asked why she hadn't struck. She could have. He was sitting with his back to the balcony. He didn't see. He didn't hear. 3 steps and a knife between the shoulder blades. Cass was silent for a moment. Then she said she'd been killing for money for 15 years. That she'd seen many places. Fortresses, palaces, prisons, military camps. None of them looked like this. She gestured toward the workshop, toward the blueprints on the walls, toward the tools neatly arranged in their places, toward the model airship Dan was assembling to test in new wing design. She said this didn't look like the place of a man who deserved to die. It looked like the place of a man who was building something. And after 15 years, she was tired of destroying things. Dan finished his tea. He looked at her. Then he said he needed a head of security. If she managed to sneak into the port unnoticed, that meant security was a complete failure. And the best person to defend was someone who knew how to attack. Cass smiled. She asked if he was afraid she might change her mind. Dan said he was afraid, but that being afraid and not doing it was the worst possible option. Cass became head of security the next day. She walked the entire port in 4 hours. She found 11 places an enemy could infiltrate, 3 weak spots in the rope bridge system, 2 unprotected aerial approaches, and a complete lack of sentries. She reported to Dan a list of 32 items that needed to be fixed immediately. Dan read it. He nodded, and added one condition. Once a week, she was to come to his workshop and build something. Anything. With her hands. That was an order. Cass looked at him as if he were crazy, but she came. The first week, she sat for 2 hours in front of a piece of wood, not knowing what to do. She knew how to pick locks, tie nooses, throw knives, but build something from scratch? She couldn't remember the last time she'd done that, if she'd ever done it at all. Dan didn't give her any hints. He just worked beside her, in silence. A month later, Cass carved his spoon out of wood. Crooked, rough, ugly. She looked at it and wanted to throw it away. Dan took the spoon. He placed it on the shelf next to the model airship. He said it was the first thing she'd created rather than destroyed, and that it would stay there. Cass didn't say anything, but the following week she came back. Eleanor Kirsch appeared quietly, just like everything else she did. She was among the refugees Volt had found on the roads of the Southern Kingdom. Thin, silent, with lifeless eyes and manners that didn't match her tattered clothes. She knew how to curtsy so well that even Wren took notice. Dan assigned her to general chores, the kitchen, cleaning, mending clothes. Eleanor didn't complain. She worked quietly and carefully. She washed dishes as if it were the most important task in the world. Every cup was scrubbed to a shine. Every plate was in its place. 2 weeks later, Cass came to Dan and placed a report on the table. She checked on all the newcomers. They all had stories. They all had reasons. They all matched up, except for one. Eleanor Kirsch. That name didn't exist in any of the exile registries, not in any of the refugee databases. A person named Eleanor Kirsch didn't exist until she appeared on a road in the Southern Kingdom 2 months ago. Dan found Eleanor in the dining hall. She was washing cups. He sat down next to her. He was silent for a moment. Then he said he knew that Eleanor Kirsch wasn't her real name. She didn't flinch. She kept washing. Then she asked quietly how he knew. Dan said his head of security was very good at her job. Eleanor set down the cup. She dried her hands. And she told him. She was Eleanor Raven, the daughter of King Damer, of the Sixth Kingdom, the one that had been destroyed 20 years ago in the war between Kernmore and Solaris. Her father had died during the siege. Her mother died while on the run. Eleanor was raised by her aunt, who had told her one thing her whole life. You are the last of the House of Raven. You must reclaim the throne. You must restore the kingdom. You are a symbol. You are the hope. You must. Eleanor was tired of having to. Tired of being a symbol. Tired of being the hope for people she didn't even know by face. She ran away, changed her name, and asked to come to port because it was the only place in the world where no one knew who she was. Gan listened. Then he said he wouldn't tell anyone. That here she was Eleanor Kirsch. That here she could wash dishes as much as she wanted. Eleanor looked at him. He said there was one thing he liked about her. That she was the only one who washed cups as if it mattered. And that he wished he had that kind of attitude toward the bolts on the airship. Eleanor laughed, quietly, briefly, as if she'd forgotten how and was trying to remember. But she laughed. The first year ended with 6 airships. The second year began with a war. Not a real war. Not yet. First came the embassy from Kernmore. 3 airships. Small ones. Poorly built. Based on stolen blueprints that had leaked through an apprentice in Volt's workshop. The apprentice had been bribed. Volt found out too late. The blueprints were incomplete. No load calculations. No wing profiles. No safety systems. 3 boxes of fabric stuffed with hot air and prayers. They rose 3 kilometers, shaking and swaying with every gust of wind. Dan spotted them through a telescope from the Olmar Observatory. 3 dots rising from behind the clouds. Cass sounded the alarm. Dan ordered everyone not to panic. He ordered them to wait. The embassy reached the port 6 hours later. Of the 3 airships, 1 lost control on approach and landed on an empty shard a kilometer from the base. The other 2 made it to the landing pad. A man in a golden cloak stepped out of the first airship's gondola, the king of Kernmore's ambassador. He gave a speech, a long one, a solemn one, about the monarch's divine right to all lands and all heavens, about the union between heaven and the crown, about mutual respect and brotherhood. The speech lasted 12 minutes. Dan listened. He nodded. When the ambassador finished, Dan asked how much his king weighed. The ambassador was taken aback. He asked Dan to repeat himself. Dan explained that he needed to know the exact weight because if the king wanted to go up to port, they would need to calculate the load capacity of the elevator platform, and that the structure doesn't distinguish between kings and peasants, only kilograms. The ambassador blushed. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. And he said that His Majesty weighed enough to crush any insolent fool. Dan nodded and said he would take that as an approximate figure. After the ambassador from Kernmore came the ambassador from Solaris, then from Telmar, then from the 2 remaining kingdoms. Each brought gold, promises, threats, proposals for alliances, proposals of marriage. One brought a charter conferring the title of Baron upon Dan. Another brought an arrest warrant for him. Both documents lay in the same diplomatic briefcase. Dan received them all. He listened. He thanked them. And he refused. Polite. Calm. With an engineering precision in his phrasing that drove the diplomats mad. Port does not form alliances. Port does not accept titles. Port trades with everyone on equal terms. The air belongs to everyone. Li Ji-wan negotiated masterfully. She spoke the language of every ambassador. She smiled at everyone. And she turned each one down in such a way that the ambassador left feeling he had gained more than he had come for. 3 months after the first diplomatic mission, Port concluded trade agreements with all 5 kingdoms. Equal terms, uniform tariffs, neutral territory, 10 airships, regular flights. Caravan routes that used to take 3 months now took 2 days. The world's economy began to change. Salt prices in Telmar fell by half. Grain prices in Kernmore stabilized. Fabrics from Solaris appeared in every kingdom. For the first time in centuries, trade outpaced war. And that was precisely when the real threat arrived. Not from kings, from the church. Cardinal Valoran Aus declared the port a heretical institution. He called Dana a demon in human form. He confirmed the shards as cursed, and he threatened anyone who traded with the port with excommunication. For merchants, this meant death. An excommunicated merchant could not trade in any city, could not stay at inns, could not hire guards. Volt arrived at the next meeting looking pale. He said that if the excommunication took effect, he would lose everything. Dan told Volt not to worry. He said he would handle it. Cass suggested solving the cardinal's problem radically. Dan said no. Murder would create a martyr. A martyr is more dangerous than a living cardinal. Another solution was needed. Iris found it. She came to Dan with a notebook and showed him her records from the past few months. She had been observing the weather and noticed a pattern. Every spring, storms would hit the southern kingdoms. Strong storms. Devastating storms. They destroyed crops and flooded villages. People died by the hundreds. The church attributed this to the wrath of the gods. It prayed, it held ceremonies, and every spring people died all over again. Iris said she could predict the storms, 2 weeks in advance, down to the day and hour. Dan understood instantly. If Port could warn people about the storms, they have time to evacuate, to save the harvest, to move the livestock to safety, hundreds of lives, every year. And then let the cardinal try to call the one who saves people a demon. Let him try to excommunicate the one who warns of disaster when the church can only pray. They launched the warning system the following spring. Port's airships delivered warnings to every major city 10 days before the storm. Accurately, reliably, every single time. The first storm hit exactly when Iris said it would. The villages were evacuated. The fields were secured. The livestock was herded away. 1 person died. 1. Instead of the usual 300. The second storm. The third. The fourth. A warning every single time. Every time, salvation. People began to look up not with fear but with hope. Cardinal Ost fell silent, not because he had resigned himself to it, but because he realized that to fight a man who saves lives is to fight life itself, and that he would lose that battle. The second year was drawing to a close when Dan decided to do what he feared most. He flew to the hall with the diagrams, alone, at night, without telling anyone. A 2-hour flight in the dark, only the stars and the wind. He entered the hall and lit a torch. The walls glowed. Diagrams, numbers, blueprints, the 4th wall. He stood before it and counted. 5 years and 8 months. He recounted them every time he flew here. The numbers hadn't changed. What lay dormant below was awakening. Slowly. Inevitable. Like a tide that cannot be stopped. Dan sat down on the floor and took out his notes. Current capacity of the port. 50 fractals developed. A population of 80. 12 airships. 3 cargo platforms. 7 workshops. 5 shipyards. Water condensers supplying 400 people. Vegetable gardens capable of feeding 200, 400, 200, and millions live down below. He couldn't save millions. He knew that. He'd known it from the very first day he read the diagram. But he could save thousands, maybe tens of thousands, if he made it in time, if he built enough, if he found a way to bring people up without explaining why. He closed his eyes and thought for a long time. And he made the second most important decision of his life. After the decision to remain silent, he would tell them. Not to everyone, not right now, but he'd start, one by one, those he trusted, those who could help, those who wouldn't break. He started with Mira, because Mira was the first person he'd brought water to, and because Mira knew how to look the truth in the eye without looking away. He led her into the hall. He showed her the 4th wall. He explained the numbers. He explained the cycle. He explained what 5 years and 8 months meant. Mira stood there and stared at the wall for a long time, in silence. Then she turned to him and said one word, Ark. Dan nodded. Mira paused. Then she said that she had spent a year looking through a telescope as people died on the shards, that she knows what death from helplessness looks like, and that she won't let it happen again, that she needs a map, a complete map of all the shards, every single one, with volumes, with resources, with capacity. So she'd know how many people could fit on top. Dan gave her an airship, a private one, with the best navigation system he could build. Mira flew for 3 months, every day, mapping every rock, every clearing, every water source. When she finished, Dan had before him a map covering an area the size of a small country, 412 shards, a total habitable area of about 20 square kilometers, with dense settlement and developed infrastructure, 40,000 people. 40,000, out of millions. Dan showed the numbers to the others, one by one. Yuna. She clenched her fists and said she would build as many airships as needed. Cass. She nodded and said she now understood why he had let her live. Iris. She was crying. And she wiped her eyes and said she needed to recalculate all the projections, because if what's sleeping down there wakes up, it will change the weather, the entire weather on the planet. Lee. She didn't cry. She took out a notebook and began to calculate. How many people? How much food? How much water? How many airships for evacuation? How many flights? How much time for each flight? She calculated for 2 hours. Then she looked up and said that by stretching every resource to the limit, they'd be able to evacuate 40,000 people in 3 months. If there were 50 airships, Eleanor. She listened in silence. Then she said she knew a thing or two about what it was like when the world was falling apart, and that she'd help. Whatever it takes. Garth punched the wall and cracked his knuckles. Then he wrapped his hand in a rag and went to start building. Ren carefully recorded the details in the log. Date. Content. Note. The countdown had begun. Olmar nodded and said he'd always known. That the shards weren't built by chance. That he'd been exiled for it. Theo said nothing. He went out to the vegetable gardens and worked until dark. Then until dawn. Then the whole next day. Mira found him sleeping between the garden beds. Next to him lay a plan to expand the gardens to include 14 new shards. Construction had changed in scale. Before, they built to live. Now they built to save. Dan had reevaluated all priorities. Capacitors on every developed shard. Gardens on every shard with soil. Airships. Lots of airships. Yuna expanded the shipyard. She hired 20 more craftsmen from the surface. Work proceeded in 3 shifts, around the clock. The sound of hammers and saws never ceased for a single minute. Dan found 11 more helium tanks on the distant shards, and another workshop with tools, and another room full of blueprints. It contained schematics for condensers capable of collecting water 10 times more efficiently than the ones Dan had been building. The ancients knew. They were preparing. They left everything behind for those who would come after them. By the end of the second year, Skyport was a city. 120 people, 60 shards developed, 18 airships, regular trade routes to all 5 kingdoms, a storm warning system, a postal service, Mira's cartographic bureau, Yuma's blacksmith shop, Iris's weather station, Lee's trading post, Cass's security service, Rena's archives, Olmar's observatory, Theo's vegetable gardens, and at the center of it all was Dan, who built, who calculated, who flew, and who silently counted down the days. The end of the 3rd year, late fall. The sky over port was gray and heavy. Low clouds crept between the shards as if they were alive. Iris said it would clear up by evening. She was right, as always. By sunset, the clouds had dispersed and the sky opened up across its full breadth from horizon to horizon. Dan stood in port's main square, the very square that Garth had paved with slabs from his first shard, the very stone to which he had been chained 3 years ago. Garth had suggested it himself. He said that history should be right under our feet, so we wouldn't forget. Buildings stood all around the square, rebuilt, fortified, alive. Workshops from which the sound of hammers could be heard. A dining hall from which the scent of bread wafted, real bread made from wheat grown in Theo's heavenly gardens. Barracks. Warehouses. The shipyard from which the 23rd airship had rolled out. The council building faced the square. Ren had insisted that the council have its own separate room, with an archive and the minutes of all meetings, with a registry of residents. 210 names. 210 people who lived in the sky, worked, built, argued, made up, fell in love, had children. The first child was born on Portu 4 months ago, a girl. They named her Alta, which meant high in the local dialect. She was born 4 kilometers above the ground and had never felt solid ground beneath her feet. For her, the sky was home. Not exile, not a curse. Home. Today was the signing ceremony. Ambassadors from all 5 kingdoms had arrived at port to sign the world's first ever air transport treaty. Li Ji-1 had been drafting this treaty for 6 months, 72 pages. Every word carefully crafted, every clause agreed upon. Equal terms for all kingdoms, uniform tariffs, the port's neutral status, guarantees for the security of trade routes, and one clause that Dan personally added: no kingdom may use air routes for military purposes. The sky does not wage war. The kings resisted this clause the most. Each wanted the right to transport troops by air. Each understood the advantage this would provide. Dan refused them all. Calmly. Politely. With the same engineering precision with which he calculated the load on a spar. He said that an airship could carry a cargo or people or weapons, but it cannot carry all 3 at once. And if airships start carrying weapons, they'll stop carrying grain. And without grain, people will die. So the choice is simple. Food or war. The kings chose food. Not out of nobility. Out of calculation. Because a starving people is more dangerous than an advancing enemy. The signing ceremony took place in the square. 5 ambassadors, 5 scrolls, 5 seals. Lee stood next to each one and translated, in 6 languages, without a hitch. With a smile that was genuine for the first time ever. 3 months ago, she went to Dan and showed him a notebook, at very one. It contained just one sentence. I want to learn how to build airships. Dan taught her every evening, just as he taught Yuna. Only Lee calculated faster. Yuna got angry. She said it wasn't fair, that it had taken her 2 years to learn what Lee picked up in a week. Dan said that Yuna felt things while Lee calculated them, and that together they were unbeatable. Yuna snorted and went to the workshop. An hour later, she returned and silently set a toolkit down in front of Lee, her own personal set, because the best student should have the best tools. Lee took the kit. She looked at Yuna, and for the first time in Dan's memory, her eyes welled up. After the signing, there was a reception. Eleanor organized it, quietly, unobtrusively, like everything she did. Tables in the square, food, music. One of the masters played something resembling a lute. The ambassadors sat together with the residents of Port. They ate from the same dishes. They drank from the same cups. On the ground, kings didn't trust one another. Here, 4 kilometers above the clouds, they sat side by side and talked, not as enemies, as people. Dan gave a speech, a short one sentence. He said, "Thank you for not letting me do this alone." Then he sat down. Mira stood next to a map of the entire known sky. She unfurled it before the ambassadors. 412 shards. Each one plotted, each one measured, each one described. The ambassadors stared and couldn't believe their own eyes. No one in history had ever seen a complete map of the shards. Now it was right in front of them. Yuna stood at the entrance to the workshop with a new hammer she'd made herself, from an ancient composite material and iron. Perfect balance, perfect weight. She no longer swore in front of the ambassadors, but one of them accidentally bumped her workbench, and Yuna told him that if he touched her tools one more time, she would personally show him the way down, without an airship. The ambassador apologized, quickly. Iris sat by the window of her observatory and wrote in her notebook. Her 10th notebook this year. Her predictions had become legendary. The captain's airships didn't take off without her say-so. She didn't say whether they would fly. She said when, down to the hour. Once, Dan asked her how she did it. Iris thought for a moment and said she didn't know. That the sky spoke to her, and she listened. Dan said that was the most scientific answer he ever heard. Iris smiled, quietly, like someone who had finally stopped being ashamed of what she could do. Cass stood on the roof of the council building and kept watch over the perimeter, even during the holiday. She had found and neutralized 3 spies over the past year, 2 hired assassins, and 1 poisoner, each without spilling a drop of blood, each without making a sound. She came to Dan's workshop every week. She crafted. Her latest creation was a throwing knife, perfectly balanced. She twirled it in her hands, and for the first time in 15 years, she didn't want to throw it at anyone. Ren sat in the archives making his final entries, the date of signing, the ambassadors' names, the text of the treaty. Record number 2417. He had kept the archives since day 1, every event, every decision, every name. A small, gaunt man who had created the history of Port, line by line. Ulmer gazed the stars. He compiled the world's first star atlas visible from an altitude of 4 kilometers. 200 constellations invisible from the ground. He gave each one a name. He named one of them Glider. Theo worked in the vegetable gardens until the very last minute before the resection. He arrived with dirty hands. Mira wiped his face as if he were a little boy. He wasn't a little boy anymore. 18 years old, tall, strong, quiet. He grew food for 210 people and was planning to expand to 40,000. Not because Dan had asked him to, because he believed it was the right thing to do. Garth sat at the edge of the square and looked down, at the clouds, at the ground that was out of sight. He didn't miss it. He missed the sea. Sometimes he said that the clouds looked like waves, that if you closed your eyes, you could imagine a deck. Dan once told him he would build a ship, an airship with a deck and masts, for Garth. Garth looked at him for a long time. Then he said Dan was crazy. Then he said he believed him. The evening came to an end. The ambassadors left for their airships. The square emptied. The lights of the port came on one by one. Oil lamps in the windows, lanterns on the mooring masts, the lights of the shipyard where the night shift was working. The skyport glowed. For the first time in the history of this world, the sky above the 5 kingdoms was not lit by stars. It was lit by people. Dan saw everyone off. He walked around the square. He checked to make sure Eleanor hadn't forgotten to eat herself. She had. He brought her a plate. She took it and said he was impossible. He said he was possible, just stubborn. She smiled. He went into the workshop, closed the door, sat down at the table. He took an old evacuation diagram out of the drawer, that very one, from the fourth wall. He copied it onto a plate so he wouldn't have to run back to the hall every time. He unfolded it on the table and began to calculate how many people it could hold. With the current infrastructure, 210. With the infrastructure expanded to 40,000. How many airships would need to be built? 50 for evacuation. 23 are already available. That leaves 27. How much time? 5 years and 2 months. He wrote, he sketched, he calculated. Outside the workshop window, the lights of his port shone, his city, his ark. The people who lit those lights didn't know why he was building so much so quickly. Some already knew. Mira, Una, Cass, Iris, Lee, Eleanor, Garth, Ren, Olmar, Theo, his circle, his team. Those who didn't ask why, those who simply built alongside him. The rest will find out when the time comes, when the port is ready, when the ark is big enough to take in those who can be saved. Dan set down his pencil. He leaned back in his chair. He looked out the window. The sky was black and full of lights. Stars above. The port's lights all around. And somewhere far below, beyond the clouds, the earth. Dark, quiet, asleep. He thought of the man whose skeleton lay on a distant shard next to a notebook in English, of the phrase where the entries had cut off. We are not victims. We are tools. Someone very patient is preparing this world for something. Maybe he was right. Maybe Dan was a tool. Maybe he hadn't been brought here by chance. Maybe this was all part of a plan, someone's plan. A patient one, a centuries-long one. A plan in which an engineer from another world finds himself on a rock in the sky and builds an ark for a civilization that doesn't know what threatens it. Maybe. But Dan didn't like the word plan. He liked the word project. A plan is an intention. A project is a blueprint. An intention can be forgotten. A blueprint can be built. He took a blank sheet of paper. He wrote a single word at the top, ark, and he began to sketch, line by line, joint by joint, detail by detail. A city in the sky, a city for 40,000 people, a city that would become the last hope of a world that doesn't know it needs hope. Outside the window, the wind carried the clouds eastward. The stars shone steadily and brightly. The lights of the port flickered in the darkness. And Dan was drawing. Because drawing was the only thing he knew how to do, and because in 5 years and 2 months his drawings would save as many lives as he could manage to draw. He drew until dawn. When the first ray of sunlight fell on the table, Dan looked up. Outside the window, the port was waking up. Smoke from the dining hall chimneys, the sound of hammers from the shipyard, people's voices, laughter. Somewhere, little Alta was crying and someone was singing her a lullaby. The city was alive. His city. His ark. Dan stood up. He rolled up the drawing. He put it in a drawer next to his English notebook and an ancient diagram. 3 documents, 3 eras, 3 attempts to save the world. He stepped out of the workshop. The morning air was cold and clear. The sky in the east was turning pink. Miro was walking across the square with a cup of tea in each hand. She held one out to him. He took it. They stood side by side watching the sunrise, in silence, because sometimes words aren't necessary. Because sometimes it's enough just to stand next to someone who knows everything you know, and to be silent together. Dan took a sip of tea. He looked up at the sky. It was vast and calm and indifferent and beautiful. It didn't know that in 5 years it would become the final home for thousands of people. It simply was, just as it always had been. Dan finished his tea. He handed the cup back to Mira. He turned toward the shipyard, and he went to build.